To the Independent Republican Mike Graham right here on Talk Radio, and here we are at the start of yet another fascinating week in the Independent Republic. The Prime Minister says we are just 38 days away from walking away from Brexit negotiations with the European Union, leaving us with a no-deal deal, which a lot of people think would not be a bad deal at all. The Natural History Museum is worrying that Charles Darwin might have been a racist. Absolute and utter madness. Black Lives Matter have announced that they now want to become a political party that stands for election. I can imagine that will go well. Lots of lost deposits coming up. And the COVID-19 madness continues with the latest news that the testing regime might be fueling the fears that things are worse than they really are. We'll be opening the show today with consultant neurologist Dr. Wakar Rashid, who, like me, is concerned about statistics that are being used to wrongly point to increasing infections and justify further lockdowns and corona restrictions. 0344 499 1000. Coming up later on, we're joined by Mail on Sunday economist Peter Hitchens, who this week didn't actually write about the COVID crisis, choosing instead to explore the National Socialists of 1930s Germany. I wonder why. Speaking of undemocratic movements, we will also be discussing the ludicrous left-wing loonies of Extinction Rebellion, who thought it was a great idea to blockade the print plants of several newspaper groups, aside from The Guardian and The Mirror, of course, in order to save the planet, effectively blocking an article by Sir David Attenborough in The Sun, which was all about, wait for it, saving the planet. 0344 499 1000. We'll also hear from Nightclub owner Donald McLeod about why illegal raves could be stopped if licensed and regulated business could open again. Believe it or not, in Scotland, you're not allowed to play any music in a bar in case people get excited, in case they start singing, in case they start dancing, or indeed in case they start talking loudly. Has Scotland gone completely bonkers mad since I lived there? I seem to remember there were plenty of people having fun in Scotland when I was there. It seems like nobody's allowed to do it anymore. And we'll be finding out why the Minister of State for Transport believes that towns and cities in this country are wasting money on pro-cycling initiatives that are punishing car drivers and indeed high street businesses as well. Most of all, though, we need to hear from you, the people that make the Independent Republic what it is, what you are hearing, what you are doing, and where you are going. We need to know it all. 0344 499 1000. You're listening to me, Mike Graham, right here on the fastest growing radio station on the planet. It is, of course, Talk Radio.
Mid-morning with Mike Graham. Talk Radio.
There was a very interesting piece that appeared over the course of the weekend because there was lots of stuff written, of course, about COVID-19 over the course of the weekend, as there always is. But the one that caught my eye was the one about testing, because we heard, of course, and it's being reported all over the news this morning. Oh, my goodness me, the number of people infected by COVID has gone up exponentially into the thousands once more. But at the same time, we're being told by Matt Hancock, while he's concerned about it, he's not that worried. So it seems that an awful lot of younger people are being infected, many of them without any symptoms whatsoever. A lot more people are being tested. So therefore, we know that hospital admissions are not up. Deaths are not up. So what exactly are we worried about? Meanwhile, on top of that, experts from the Oxford University Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine say that there are lots of false positives being found in various tests. And in fact, some tests might be finding traces of the virus which has already died, meaning that the people who are saying that they are testing positive are actually not testing positive. Let's talk to Dr. Wakar Rashid, consultant neurologist and specialist in multiple sclerosis. Wakar, a very good morning to you. Welcome.
Morning, Mike. Thanks for having me on again. Thank you.
Not at all. No, I saw you tweet about this at the weekend, and I thought it would be a good opportunity to talk to you about sort of where we are and generally where we are going, because, of course, at the moment, we are being told that, yes, infections are getting quite high again. Is that of concern? Should it be of concern? But when you put it together with the numbers of testing that are going on and some of the testing results possibly being false positives, what can we make of it?
Okay, so, and apologies, Monday morning's probably not the best time to get very scientific, so I'll try and make this sort of understandable for your listeners, because it's a very important issue. Essentially, the test that is done is something called a PCR test, and what that seeks to do is find fragments of the virus in the sample that it receives. Yeah. Now, those fragments may be tiny, and so the test is run repeatedly at increasing concentrations, what's called amplifying or cycles, to try and increase the pickup of the virus. And so the issue, which was really well laid out by the Centre of Evidence-Based Medicine in Oxford, is that the amplification, the cycles are enormous. They're 30 plus, which is quite a high number. So it's really a very, very sensitive test that they're running. So it's picking up potentially tiny amounts of the viral fragments. And as you said in your opening, some of these fragments may already have been inactivated and dead. And so the issue is just of the positives. So we only get a yes/no answer from the test. Actually, on that yes, we're essentially treating people who may have a lot of the viral DNA and may have a lot of symptoms and therefore are going to be infected, the same as people who may have a tiny amount of dead virus who one would have thought would be far less infected. We're essentially giving the same results, but it's a huge gap between the two in terms of the scenario.
Well, that seems to be the problem. And I think most of us now have a reasonable understanding of the dangers of the virus, that we do behave slightly differently than we used to behave. If you took, what we did last year, for example, to where we are now, there's a massive difference in our behaviour. Now, there are those who will tell you, and I heard somebody last night saying this from the medical community, that one of the reasons why the increase in testing is not resulting in an increase in hospital admissions is because of our behaviour. It's because we are social distancing, because we are not crowding into rooms with one another anymore. Is that a possibility, or is that just kind of more smoke and mirrors?
There's several possibilities, but and I put this out on my Twitter yesterday evening. We're trying to compare like with like, but we don't have like with like. So the testing regime, so the number of people who are tested and who's been tested is different now in the last month or so to where we were a few months ago. If you remember, in March, April, when the hospital admissions were at their height, people who were tested were only people really who were coming into hospital,
right,
or who had very significant symptoms in the community. Even then, sometimes they weren't being tested.
Right.
So we're actually testing a whole different population of people now, and the number of tests has gone up. So there's various credible theories I've seen about why we're seeing so many more test positives and very little in the way of hospital admissions and infection. But actually, we're trying to compare different things now. So trying to compare tests over months is a really difficult thing. So I heard in your introduction there's a thought about more young people are getting infected now than before. But actually, if you think about it, in March or April, young people weren't really being tested for COVID before. It was only people who were coming into hospital who were very much older people because they were getting more severe symptoms. So there's a lot of theory, but it's actually hard to prove. And if you think about it as well, now, before lockdown, it was said about 10 to 15% of people in London had been exposed to the virus. Now, that's a huge number of people. And yes, there were a lot of people coming into hospital with infections and severe infections and sadly dying as well. But if you look at it, the actual number of people now proportionately coming into hospital with significant infections may not be that different to the positive test, because there were so many more infections going on at the height of the actual virus. So I think there's a lot of things on the table we just don't know. We need to work this out, because unfortunately, on the basis of these positive tests, which I've already talked about, it's a huge range of people being given a yes answer. We're basing policy on this at the moment.
And also, do you think there are people inside the Department of Health, Dr. Wacker, who understand that your misgivings and my misgivings are shared by a great many people who want to know exactly how dangerous this virus is, who want to know whether it's safe to go back to work or safe to send their kids to school? And the figures, I'm afraid, do not really reveal that to us. All they do is serve to kind of make people more scared, isn't it?
I think, the misgivings are shared by a lot of people in the medical profession as well. And, you saw the article, you've quoted the article from Professor Hennigan and the team in Oxford. So, there's a lot of medical people who are wondering about how we interpret and use these tests. I've always said, if you have a test, you've got to be able to interpret it. Otherwise, it's a difficult test to do. And you wonder about how useful it is. You've got to interpret any test you do in medicine properly. And so I'm sure that there are people in the Department of Health. I'm sure they know this, and I'm sure they're working on this because, they're experts in the field. I think the problem is we've got into a bit of a cycle at the moment, I think, within policy and within the reporting of policy and so on, where everybody wants to know the case numbers now. They want to know, they want to compare, and they want to look and say, oh, look, it's going up compared to June or whatever. but the detail is the problem here, and having understanding of the detail is the issue, because you don't you've only got a limited time scale. You may not have the figures presented to you, but the amount of testing, say, that was going on in June was less than it is now, and the people who were getting tested is different now. For instance, we are testing people now. So if you look at Bolton, which has been in the news recently, so they had a spike in positive tests. Now, I'm not sure, I'm not being able to see how many actual cases that was, but if it's a relatively small number of cases, but proportionately is quite high, there is error there. There can always be error in a relatively small number of patients and positive cases. So we always have to interpret that with caution. But what happens after that is that once you have positive tests in an area of concern, then you get more people going in testing. And you get more, you get the contacts of the positive test cases being tested as well. So you kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of potentially finding more positive cases. But what we don't know is that how effective these people are who've had the positive test. And that's why we need to know just how positive, if you like, these cases are. How much DNA is it? Is it a low positive or is it a high positive? And try and then work out, just on the basis of the presence of symptoms and how long ago they had symptoms, how many of these people who've had positive tests actually are at risk of passing the infection on.
But this is the trouble, isn't it? And you said at the start, Wakar, that this is not a good time to be getting too scientific first thing on a Monday morning when people's heads might be a little bit fuzzy. But I mean, the problem for a lot of people, I think, and I include myself in this, is that we are bombarded with all of this information. All of these statistics come out. We're not really given the tools with which to interpret them. We don't really know what they mean, except for the fact that we're told it means something bad. And I don't think people are buying it anymore. And I think when people see Matt Hancock, for example, saying testing is the answer, we must test everybody at all times as much as possible, and then they see Grant Shapps, the Transport Minister, saying, well, we can't test people at airports because there's not really any point. Yeah, there's a kind of disconnect going on, isn't there?
As I completely agree. And as I said, I think if you test, whatever test you do, you've got to be able to interpret it correctly.
Right.
If you're interpreting
otherwise, what's
that
the
test,
point?
Yeah, and it can actually do harm. So if you do a test and you pick out the wrong sort of interpretation of the result, it can be harmful as well. So you've got to be able to interpret the data that you're given. And I don't think people are doing it maliciously. I think there is a knowledge gap here because we're learning. And what's happening and what's picked up in terms of the paper that you quoted from Oxford is that we've learned a bit more. So it is clear that this test, the PCR test that has been done, is extremely sensitive. So it is picking up very small fragments, and it is also clear it is staying positive even after the expected infectiousness of somebody. So we would normally consider the virus to be infectious up to about 8 to 10 days, but this test is staying positive, looking at some papers, many weeks after that. So this has got to be, I'm not saying we shouldn't be testing, but I'm saying is that we should be caveating, we should be looking at the results in the way of saying, well, perhaps not every one of these positive results is going to result in infection. And if you like, the one stable measure we've had throughout this whole epidemic has been the hospital figures. And I think we really need to be giving much more credence to the hospital figures. So, what the criteria for people being admitted to hospital with COVID has been relatively consistent throughout this. And that's been people who've got significant enough infection to warrant assistance with their breathing. So they cannot stay at home because they'll be in trouble from a lack of oxygen from breathing problems. That's been the main reason people have been admitted to hospital from COVID. And so that hasn't really changed. And so that would be the figure. And I'm not alone in saying this amongst the medical profession at all. That is the figure that you can more usefully, I think, compare over the epidemic. And so that is the figure, I think, which I think is more useful to be looking for if we are seeing spikes or second waves or whatever you want to call it, is looking to see if there's an increase in hospital admissions.
Yes, and there doesn't appear to be one. I mean, all the anecdotal evidence that I've seen, the information I get from people around the country who either are nurses or who are working with nurses are saying that there is no more admissions, never mind, an increase in admissions. There literally aren't any admissions going on at all for COVID-19. And for most of the figures that we get for people who may have died or who may be on ventilators, they've all been there for quite a long time. They're the people who have been suffering for a while. And so at what point would you say the government should be coming out and actually saying, we actually think that the risk here is becoming quite low?
So you're right. I think the hospital admissions over months have been reassuring in the last couple of months in particular. So if you consider Leicester, for instance, which obviously had an increased set of measures a month or so ago.
Yeah.
If you actually look at the hospital admissions, thankfully, they really didn't move. Even, we would expect to see something of a spike a week or two after an increase in positive case numbers, and we just didn't see that. There was a mild increase, but nothing.
And of course,
really
the
to write home about.
The government presumably will say, "Oh, that's because we locked it all down, and that was what we managed to survive because we didn't have to admit anybody to hospital because of our action." I'm not sure that's true.
So you would expect if there was a effect of the measures that would come through a little bit later, another week or two after the measures, and that there should be an increase in hospital activity prior to that decrease. So there's normally about a week or two lag, and again it just wasn't really seen. And certainly the figures, and I wrote about this in the Spectator as well, we just didn't really see that. And thankfully the hospital admissions remained down. I've seen various theories that perhaps it's the young people getting it and they're stronger and fitter, but I say again, it's very hard to prove that because young people just weren't being tested early on. So I think you've got to say that although the positive case numbers are increasing, you've got to be proportionate in your actions to that, in that we're not seeing an increase in hospital numbers, but we've got to keep very, very conscious and careful so that if we are starting to pick up that increased activity, then it is acted on. But I think that is a more stable and useful measure.
But also, I mean, knowing what we know now about COVID-19, and I'm in no way diminishing how important it is and how dangerous it can be and how deadly it can be. But if, for example, you tracked any other disease in the same way as we're tracking COVID-19, we would similarly be alarmed, I would have thought, by the increases in infection. For example, imagine if you tracked on any given winter the number of people infected by the common cold, and then you would come out every night on 6 o'clock news and say, today 50,000 people were infected by the common cold, and everyone would go, oh my God, we better stay home, don't go on holiday, don't go to work, don't go to school. I mean, we just wouldn't, would we?
It's like I say, I think we've somehow got into this cycle of testing and reporting testing numbers and so on. And I recall going back to the early days, there was one of the stated aims from the Department of Health was trying to increase testing numbers and get to 100,000 figure and so on. It didn't seem to me, well, okay, what's the purpose of this? And so now we're in this cycle of giving data or numbers for the sake of it and then getting frightened by the results.
I think it was just to stop Beth Rigby asking any more stupid questions, I think. I sympathise because I think, it's political and non-scientific trained journalists having to ask very scientific based questions, and I think it's very hard. And I think this is why I think there needed to be a bit of sort of scientific basis or knowledge from the Department of Health saying, look, the reason we're not going to just test randomly for large numbers, that is because of X, Y, and Z. And it's just explaining why you're doing this, because we're asking political journalists to ask very scientific-based questions. And the one fear I have, going back to a point you just made now, is that we are going to come to autumn, winter, and we're going to see more COVID-type symptoms. And how does this country deal with that and keep going? If we're going to get a number of positive tests back, but with the flaws that I already mentioned, on the background of there being increasing respiratory viruses in general, and that's a concern. Yes, absolutely right. And we will always be concerned about it. I just wonder when we pass and cross over the Rubicon into concern versus absolute, blind terror. And I think we should be moving away more from the terror aspect to it to concern. But how about this? Let me leave you with this thought. Mick has tweeted in and said more people were stabbed over the weekend than died of COVID-19, which is, I'm afraid, correct.
Yeah, and I've seen various analogies on Twitter and people saying, well, COVID is infectious, and that's certainly true. And so we never should be complacent about this. But as you say, there's a lot of other infections around as well, and so it's getting it into context, being vigilant, particularly about the hospital data. But we do, and I do think the test data can be useful. It just needs to be contextualized and a bit more detail from that, which can, I think, be done. And I think it needs to be urgently done before the winter increase in symptoms are upon us.
Yes, I believe you're absolutely right. Dr. Waqar Rashid, thank you very much indeed. Consultant urologist, specialist, of course, in MS as well. A man who, like me, believes that, the testing's all very well, and the figures are all very well, and the statistics are all very well, but they need to be put into context. We're constantly being told you need to put things into context, otherwise if you take them out of context, that's a bad idea. Well, how about this? Tell us how many people are going into hospital. Tell us how many people are dying as a result of being infected in the last month. And we'll know at that point whether or not there's anything to worry about. There are still people claiming they can't go back to work because it's too dangerous. Still people saying they might not want to send their kids to school because it's too dangerous. There's one particular school, which I read about over the weekend, which is going to be asking the kids at the school to change their mask every time they go into the corridor, which means they need 6 masks per day, which means they need 30 masks per week, which means some ridiculous amount of money is going to have to be spent by the parents in order to make sure that each of those children has 6 clean masks to take to school every day. It's absolute madness, isn't it? This is Talk Radio.
Talk Radio.
Now, I've got a little journalism lesson to give you before we do anything else. We've got lots of great tweets coming in, by the way. Some negative, some positive, some just neutral. But we like all that. We like people disagreeing with us on this show. And we also like people calling us to tell us they're disagreeing with us, because then we can have a proper debate. 0344 499 1000 is the number. Now, here is the front page of The Guardian. Now, I know what you're expecting me to do now. You're expecting me to rip it up, right? But no. I'm actually going to do The Guardian a favour today, not least because they were one of the few papers that came out on time on Saturday, because the numpties from Extinction Rebellion decided that, The Guardian doesn't ever print anything which isn't true. The fact that they used paper and cut down the same number of trees, well, actually a lot fewer trees than the Times and the Sun, because they don't sell so many copies. They still harm the environment, people. Right, The Guardian is just as harmful to the environment as every other newspaper. Extinction Rebellion scientists, right, are not very clever at science, are they? But here's a treat for you, because this is why The Guardian is such a useless organ of news, right? They've got a headline on the front page that says, "Suspects at large after random Midlands stabbings." Now, the first lesson that you are taught as a headline writer is never project into the future a situation which is fluid. For example, don't ever say that there's a man on the run, because by the time the paper comes out, he might not be on the run. He might have been caught. And guess what? The suspect who's at large is no longer at large because he's been caught. So The Guardian now looks really, really idiotic. It looks like yesterday's paper rather than today's. So Alexandra Topping, Vikram Dodd, Helen Pidd, 3 people who contributed to this story, should take note from me, a veteran of these things. Don't ever put suspects at large in a headline in a newspaper that isn't going to come out for several hours. In the same way as you might as well put on the front page, it's raining at the moment, because when you buy the paper in the morning, it might not be raining. You see what I mean? Maybe I will just tear it up anyway. Absolute rubbish. Let's get some news headlines from Ross Powell.
Talk Radio. Half-hour headlines.
The names of 22 people who died in the Manchester Arena bombing have been read out at the start of the public inquiry into the terror attack. Earlier, families met and stood in silence to remember their loved ones before the inquiry's chairman, Sir John Saunders, formally opened proceedings.
We will hear evidence from survivors for whom these events were traumatic and from which they have not physically recovered. We will hear evidence from people who witnessed events which were so distressing that being required to relive them in evidence is going to be extremely difficult.
Well, the inquiry is being held in a converted courtroom in Manchester with safety measures in place so as many survivors and families can attend in person as possible. Dozens of Julian Assange supporters have gathered outside the Old Bailey, where the WikiLeaks founder is set to continue his fight against extradition to the US. The 49-year-old, who has been in high-security Belmarsh prison for 16 months, is wanted over the publication of hundreds of thousands of classified documents in 2010 and 2011. A man's been arrested arrested on suspicion of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder following a series of stabbings in Birmingham city centre over the weekend. West Midlands police are questioning a 27-year-old who was arrested at an address in the Selly Oak area of the city at around 4 o'clock this morning. And it's claimed new laws reportedly being drawn up by the government risk bringing down free trade talks with the EU and forcing a hard border on the island of Ireland. The plans, being published this week, would override the Brexit withdrawal agreement, which is enshrined in law. Conservative MP Ian Duncan-Smith has told Talk Radio the proposal is actually just key to preserving British justice in our courts.
This bill would essentially lock out the Supreme Court and other courts in the UK from referring to European law or to the judgments of the Court of Justice on a whole range of issues. In other words, they would have to look quite rightly to Parliament for their laws rather than to go to this supranational body.
A look at the weather. A dry start for England and Wales, but there will be some heavy downpours across Scotland first thing. That rain will spread into Wales and the Midlands as we head towards lunchtime. Highs of 20 in the southeast.
Across the UK, online, on DAB, and on your smart speaker. Drive with Dan Wootton on Talk Radio.
We'll have the breaking news of the day and the biggest newsmakers combined with feisty political debate and A-list guests.
Drive with Dan Wootton, Monday to Thursday afternoons from 4 on Talk Radio. Mid-morning with Mike Graham. Talk Radio. The Independent Republic of Mike Graham on Talk Radio.
Couple of tweets to read out to you. Steve says, Mike, it is clear to me the focus on positive tests is to keep the COVID ghouls in the public eye. The likes of the BBC, Sky and GMB cannot hide their glee. I'm stunned any semi-intelligent viewer cannot see the way they have pivoted away from death numbers. Well, it is weird, isn't it? There's no point in telling us how many people have been infected by the disease unless it's actually causing a massive problem. Modernist says this, common sense from Dr. Wakar. I wish he could infect this government and Sage with some of it. Is Chris Whitty, A, now the most powerful man in the land, and B, the most cautious? We want our old lives back before we do lockdowns for summer flu, the common cold, and any other viral disease. And Andrew says, thanks very much for making that your first story. Very important to highlight how cases don't always mean illness. Well, that's true. The other big story, of course, on the front pages today is Brexit, believe it or not. I know some of you would like to think that it's actually disappeared, but the Express has got Boris, no deal, Brexit is a good outcome. The Times, no deal can be a good outcome, it's his Prime Minister. And the Telegraph, Johnson, 38 days for a Brexit deal, or we walk. Let's talk to an old friend of ours, Anand Menon, who we haven't spoken to much, actually, since the start of all this pandemic nonsense. Anand, a very good morning to you. Welcome back.
Morning to you, Mike. You all right?
I'm very well. Are you still celebrating your football team's accession to the Premier League?
Well, celebrations are sort of gradually giving way to terror as we face the prospect of Liverpool on Saturday.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's all very well going, yeah, we're great, we're back. Okay. Anyway, so I mean, it's a bit like Brexit, isn't it? Because we'd all forgotten about it, to be honest, for quite a long time. And suddenly in the last week or two, we've had Barnier talking about how nobody's being very helpful. Suddenly focus is back on the deal or no deal. What do you make of the story this morning that there's a sort of October the 15th deadline? We love a deadline, don't we?
Well, we do, and this deadline makes a bit of sense because it's not a random date. On the 15th, the EU is meant to have a summit, and I think what the Prime Minister is saying is we need to have something in the way of an agreement by then so that he can go there, thrash out the final details, and then get a deal. I mean, one of the things that's been missing from the Brexit talks because of the pandemic is engagement by the top political leaders. And it's only when you get that you get concessions, and it's only when you get concessions that you're going to get a deal. Right.
So as far as you're concerned, is any kind of deal preferable to a no deal still? Or is Boris right to say, do you know what, if you can't get your act together, we'll just walk away?
Well, I don't think the Prime Minister has ever said that no deal is preferable to a deal.
Right.
And I think in that sense, he's right. I think what a deal gives us, I think, is at least two things. One, it helps to mitigate the economic impact of leaving. That is to say, for instance, not having tariffs and quotas is better than having tariffs and quotas for trade. But as important, I think, that if these talks collapse without an agreement, the danger is then you end up with a period of mutual recrimination between us and the EU, where it becomes politically very difficult for us to have anything to do with each other or to collaborate over anything. And at a time when you have issues like, the newest Russian poisoning scandal, issues over China, it would make more sense if we were in a situation where we were able to cooperate with our nearest neighbours rather than we were at a standoff with them.
Right. Are they in the same sort of place that we are, though? Because politically speaking, Britain has been kind of treading water, hasn't it, in terms of everything aside from coronavirus for the best part of the last 6 months, really. And presumably Europe has got its own problems there, and the European Union specifically has got its own problems because aside from anything else, all of our economies are sort of teetering on the brink.
Yeah, I think to the extent that Brexit has fallen down the agenda of politics in this country, it's fallen further and faster in the European Union. And that's one of the problems, is a lack of attention to it. But yeah, they've got the COVID pandemic to deal with. They're very focused on the economic impact of that, and they've got this massive budget that they're trying to finalise. So yeah, it's absolutely fair to say that they're distracted.
Right. And as far as their attitude is concerned, I mean, Michel Barnier came to London last week. He didn't seem particularly contrite about anything, but equally he didn't seem anywhere near as aggressive as he used to be. He seemed as almost resigned to the fact that, you know, he's finally accepted that it's happening, and he's finally accepted that there may not be much he can do to influence the outcome.
Absolutely. I mean, Michel Barnier has been quite negative about the talks for quite a long time.
Yeah.
What was interesting over the weekend was that David Frost, the UK negotiator, did an interview with one of the Sunday papers in which he echoed that kind of sentiment. He sounded really downbeat and was saying, actually, we're not going to give way, and if no deal is the outcome of that, so be it. So both sides are sounding fairly pessimistic. Now, as we know from the saga of the last 3 or 4 years, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not going to come back together at the 11th hour and come up with an agreement. But I think it's fair to say there are real differences of principle that will make that difficult to achieve.
Right. And what sorts of pressures do you think Boris is under within the party itself in terms of, you know, he more or less made it a very uninhabitable place for Remainers in the Tory party. So most of the pressure, I'm assuming, is coming from Leavers who want him to get as hard a deal as possible and maybe even a no deal. But the SNP's already kicking off about it. You know, Nicola Sturgeon, in rather unparliamentary language, is calling the Tories a bunch of charlatans.
Well, he's coming under conflicting pressure from within his party, I think, is the simple answer, because while you have people like Ian Duncan Smith, who we just heard from, who are pressing for not only no deal, but for unpicking the deal that we have, which is the withdrawal agreement, there are others, I think, who haven't yet made their voices heard as much, who are slightly nervous about the prospect of no deal, and even more nervous about the prospect of the UK reneging on agreements it negotiated and signed up to only a year ago.
Yes, exactly right. So is there any way that you see, for example, the fisheries and the state aid, two of the big issues apparently, which are the main sticking points, ever being surrendered by Boris?
I mean, I'm not sure it's a question of surrender. I can see outcomes on fisheries in particular, less easily on state aid, where both sides give a bit and you end up with an agreement. So if you want to take state aids, for instance, I think the notion that we will abide by EU law and be under the authority of the European Court of Justice is for the birds. But a notion whereby the EU says, if you are using state aids to undermine competitiveness in the market, we reserve the right to retaliate with tariffs or something like that. Yeah. I can see that being possible, yeah.
Right. And, I mean, in terms of what happens on January the 1st, which is always a difficult day to begin anything, really, since everyone's got a massive hangover and it's a bank holiday apart from anything else. What do you, if I said to you, look into your crystal ball, Anand, and tell me what it looks like on the M2 going down to Dover, what does it look like?
Well, I think, as you said, on January the 1st, it looks very quiet because everyone is off and there'll be far less trade crossing that border on that day. But I don't think there's any doubt that actually, either with the kind of deal we're negotiating or without one, there is going to be significant changes to the way we trade with the European Union. And at best, there are going to be some teething problems over the first few days and weeks. And at worst, there's going to be significant disruption for the medium term because there simply isn't the infrastructure in place. And we're used to trading at a volume that the new arrangement is going to make very, very hard to sustain.
Right. And since it was the big question of last week, although it now seems to have disappeared into the ether like all 24-hour stories in this country, it seems to me, Tony Abbott, new Brexit negotiator, is he going to do a good job?
Well, he's not a Brexit negotiator. He's going to be a member of the Board of Trade, and he's one of several members of the Board of Trade. But ultimately, it's not going to be down to Tony Abbott, though he might help grease a few wheels, shake a few hands for the government because he's a former Prime Minister, he has connections. But the most important thing about trade negotiations is going to be what we're willing to offer. And I think we'll find with a lot of trade partners that state aids will be an issue with them too. They're not going to sign up to deals allowing market access if they think the British government is going to unfairly subsidise firms to give them a comparative advantage. So all trade negotiations are going to be about give and take, about compromise. And the other thing worth bearing in mind is I suspect those trade negotiations will become a lot harder if we do what some are saying and start unpicking an agreement we signed last year, because people will start to wonder whether we'll do that to them.
Yes, quite. And thank you very much indeed. Alan Menon there, Director of the UK in a Changing Europe, because what has happened today is that Boris Johnson's come out and said that there are 38 days until October the 15th, at which point, if a deal has not been struck by the European Union and the UK, then there will be no deal. I, for one, would be more than happy. Why give them 38 days? Why don't you just give them 8 days and cut it back down and make them work for a living instead of actually giving them over a month to work out what they can and cannot do? I'm sure that most of you out there listening to this would be more than happy. And in fact, all of the evidence would suggest that you would be more than happy to just go without a deal. Because at the end of the day, as I've constantly said over the times when we used to talk about nothing else apart from Brexit, that there's always going to be negotiations. It will continue as an ongoing process. There will always be somebody talking about something. There will always be a trade deal to discuss. There will always be a new part of something to negotiate. There will never, ever be a point at which you sign a document and then everything's sorted. There will always be things that you have to, sort of finesse. There will always be things that you have to reintroduce. There will always be circumstances that change, because that is the way of the world. Look at what's happened between January and now. We had January 31st, the deadline came, we left the European Union. Then something called COVID-19 suddenly struck the world and everything changed. And now we're sitting here talking about Brexit again as if there was nothing in between. But in fact there was. So I would say just give them 8 days, forget about 38 and leave without a deal. That would be my suggestion. 0344 499 1000. We've got loads more coming up, including Peter Hitchens, of course, at 11 o'clock to give us the latest from his world about the COVID lockdown, about the mask-wearing scenario, and, of course, about much else besides. Don't forget, we are live streaming on YouTube, so you can watch us as well as listening to us. Join the ever-growing throng of listeners and viewers that we have, because we are the home of common sense. So it makes absolutely perfect sense to listen to us, to watch us, and to not watch anything else. Why would you bother? This is Talk Radio.
Across the UK, online, on DAB, and on your smart speaker. Talk Radio.
Mike Graham right here on Talk Radio. Now, I don't know whether we're prepared for this at all at any point, but we have been playing over the course of the last few weeks Land of Hope and Glory and, of course, Rule Britannia. It seems to me that this would be a perfect opportunity to give us a little blast of that, because we're about to talk about the history of this great country, and not just the history of this great country, but the history of, in fact, the entire world. The history of the planet, no less, because believe it or not, after what we've heard about what's happened at the British Museum, where they have basically removed the statue of the man who founded the British Museum and whose first kind of artefacts were bought by the British Museum, right? We now hear the same nonsense coming out of the Natural History Museum. Now, I found a picture, which I will post very shortly, all about the Natural History Museum and a visit that I made there with my children when they were much younger than they are now. My youngest son is wearing what can only be described as a sort of a pith helmet, the like of which any kind of explorer would have been wearing back in the day. He's standing in front of a statue of Charles Darwin, who is inside the Natural History Museum's kind of main hall as you go in. It's right at the end. He sits in a chair. Most of you have probably seen it, right? Now, Charles Darwin is the founder, you might say, of modern science. The Origin of the Species is a book that he wrote in which he basically set down in scientific terms all of the natural world's knowledge and the natural world's knowledge that he found, right? Now, if you were to say to me, you'll never believe what's happening now, Charles Darwin is being accused of being possibly a racist, which might mean that we have to remove any reference to Charles Darwin from the Natural History Museum. If you're watching this on YouTube right now, you'll be able to see a statue, the one I'm talking about, of Charles Darwin. It is really quite remarkable that we have got to this point. Now, let us talk to William Clouston, who's leader of the SDP, the Social Democratic Party. We'll play a little bit of Rule Britannia shortly. But before we do that, let's find out from William what he makes of all this. William, a very good morning to you.
Great to be back. Yeah, very well, thanks.
Thanks very much indeed for joining us. I mean, I could scarcely believe my eyes when I saw this yesterday, when I thought to myself, surely to God, these idiots that run these museums are not about to remove the bust and or the statue of Charles Darwin or any mention of Charles Darwin in their exploration and their racial review of what is going on in terms of the collections that they have inside the Natural History Museum. I mean, it is one of the greatest museums in the world, isn't it?
It is, but there's no limit to how far this stuff is going to go. I mean, there isn't a limit. And the problem is, Mike, the boards of our quangos and our institutions are crammed full of woke liberals and progressives that basically are embarrassed about this country, are not prepared to support it or defend it. And in particular, they don't grasp that Britain has been a force for good in the world, and they won't defend it.
Well, exactly right. And of course, once they realised they were under attack, because there was a piece written in the Telegraph which basically said there was this review underway, they issued to anyone who tweeted them a kind of a bog standard tweet in which they called the article purely speculative, which usually means it's true because it means they're not actually denying it. They then issued by word of a kind of an explanation, an article that was in their very own newspaper in which it basically said that all museums of natural history are intrinsically racist.
Yeah, the trouble. I mean, again, it's balmy. You've got an institution which is based on history, and yet none of the people in it seem to be able to get the nuance between then and now. Yeah, sure, Darwin's voyage took place at a time when we had an empire, and I'm sure if you look hard enough, you could look at even moral philosophers like J.S. Mill or David Hume. You could find something they said then which isn't applicable now, and perhaps we've moved on. But again, it's to learn from history, to understand history is to understand that it changes. People's views do change, and to judge previous generations and previous historians and explorers and scientists by today's standard, it's just very unnuanced.
Well, exactly right. And also the thing that annoys me most about this, William, and I said this about the British Museum as well, these people that currently are in charge of these museums don't own them. It's not up to them what happens to them. They have no bearing on the future of the museum, and it's absolutely and utterly arrogant and quite disgusting for them to start telling me what they're going to keep in it. Actually, it belongs to all of us.
It does. They can't start putting artifacts through their sort of woke committee and saying, well, we can have that, but we can't have that. I mean, I read the reports on this, and they're even complaining about depictions of tobacco on the ceiling. I mean, tobacco is a fact. It's a fact of imperial history, and it's a fact today. It just beggars belief. I don't know. I mean, I think some of this, Mike, is to do with the moral panic that we're going through because of BLM just now. I think what you've got sort of boardrooms of the corporate sector, and you've got charity boards and so on, just panicking and thinking we've got to give way to this stuff. But the problem is that they're giving way to a very bossy minority inside these institutions. And every time they do that, they alienate the mainstream majority. We have to put up with this stuff. And actually, as you say, there are museums.
Well, exactly right. And also, I mean, to be fair to Black Lives Matter, I don't recall hearing them saying that all these museums have to be somehow reshot and all of their histories have to be re-examined and things have to be thrown out and exhibits have to be taken down. These are all people who are reacting to something that actually hasn't been said.
Yeah, they overstep. Yeah, I think it's because they're panicking, Mike. I mean, the SDP has recently published our policy on arts and culture. And I think basically, if you're going to start cancelling things, you don't stand for free speech, your funding will go. That's basically our policy. The purpose of some of these institutions should be to show it as it was and as it is, not start filtering things. Let's have a debate, and their funding should be dependent on that.
Yeah, I mean, this article that they've written talks about, people and individuals in the past who were not properly recognised, even though they may have had a bigger role on the basis that they might have been, local slaves, or they might have been, people who weren't engaged in the exploration specifically. Well, why don't they just include that? Why do they have to take something out? Why don't they just add that in?
They could easily do that, and there would be nothing wrong with that. That's fine. What I object to is these people judging our history more harshly than other people.
Yeah.
I mean, why when you're doing a critique of imperial history, do you not consider the Mongol Empire or the Ottoman Empire or what was going on in South America or any of the African empires? Why not have a look at those and then judge those according to the same criteria?
Yeah, exactly.
But it's this idea that we're uniquely bad. And I think the problem is the government and the other people don't realise that these institutions are stocked full of people who are basically our cultural enemies and won't stick up for us.
I mean, how about this for a paragraph of absolute and utter tosh, right? There are numerous ways to engage with historical racism in European natural history museums, including talking about these forgotten narratives and creating equal opportunities in scientific study. I don't even know what that means. I mean, it seems to mean that they're already talking about it. So what's the problem?
There's no end to talking about it, Mike. I mean, it can't. When you start down this road of running the rule over everything in these terms, there isn't any. The whole. I mean, just walk around London. The whole thing is part of our imperial history. Yeah, you can't airbrush it. There isn't a sort of.
Well, that's not going to stop Sadiq Khan, by the way. Sadiq Khan apparently is going to try and airbrush most of it. He wants to change the names of streets. He wants to take down statues he doesn't like. I mean, it's absolutely outrageous what these people are doing.
You'd be left with literally nothing else. Yeah. Nothing would be left if that's what you want. As I say, I just think we need to be a little bit. You've got a Tory government with an 80-seat majority. They just need to get serious about this. Rod Liddle used to joke that all of these charity boards and agencies and quangos are stuffed full of people that view the same life in the same way, and he used to call it the 6 degrees of Shami Chakrabarti, because you can always get back to her. And I think he's got a point.
Well, he absolutely has. I mean, I'd quite like to do away with any trace of Sadiq Khan. Like anything that he's ever done. Can we just get rid of it? Get rid of all the cycle lanes, get rid of all the ridiculous bollards everywhere. I tried to drive through Greenwich the other day, much to my chagrin, discovered that they've closed off half the roads with flower pots, right? What are you supposed to do if there's a fire?
Yeah, no, it's crazy. As I say, I think we just need to be more muscular and remember that when people speak with common sense, the SDP's policies, we sometimes joke that they're radical, but it used to be called common sense. Yeah. I mean, literally until yesterday, these would have been accepted as normal ways to behave.
Yeah, well, of course, listen, William, you should know by now you can't use the word normal, because that in itself is some kind of prejudicial term, which is only made by a white middle-class, middle-aged man. And I mean me rather than you, obviously. But I mean, the world has gone completely bonkers mad, and I think we really have to fight back. Winning the fight against the BBC with Rule Britannia, I see that as a massive step in the right direction, and I think this should be another one.
Yeah, go for it. I mean, I think we need, as I say, more muscularity there, but not just from commentators and campaigners, but from the government itself. If they can't address this stuff now with the majority they've got, they're not conservative. I mean, I've criticised them for years as being conservative in name only. Yeah. And I think they are. But they really, if they can't do it, then perhaps the public should look elsewhere. But no, we should be much, much more confident in asserting and arguing our case against this nonsense.
Yeah, I think we should, particularly when it comes to our museums, which are, after all, our sort of, bread and butter, if you like, the history of our nation. And they are the sort of the ambassadors to tourists. They are the ambassadors to children in schools, and they are the sort of the guardians, if you like, of our heritage. And so they shouldn't be stripping it away and taking bits of it out just because a couple of, as you say, 50 shades of not 50 shades, it's a 6 degrees of separation from Shami Chakrabarti, because she doesn't like the idea that Darwin might have been a bit of a racist. So it's unbelievable.
Yeah, no, it's crazy. And no, public funding, think about it this way, these institutions receive millions and millions, right? Billions, actually. Yeah. And I think part of their role should be to celebrate British culture. They're there to defend it and to celebrate it, not to attack it. And I just think, unless we can change the composition of these boards and put some people in there that actually are prepared to do that, this is going to recur again and again and again.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. William Clouston, the leader of the SDP, very sensible man, very sensible political party, actually. There is news on the horizon. We may talk about this later on in the week. Black Lives Matter is thinking of forming themselves into a political party. That would be great news, because it would mean they'd actually have to stand at elections and get slaughtered and realise that actually nobody supports them. That would be the way forward for me. Let's have a little blast of something patriotic. Why not? Time to say a very good morning to Mr. Peter Hitchens. Peter, how the devil are you?
Well, so far so good. But,
excellent.
Pretty miserable about the political and economic and general situation, I'm afraid.
Well, it's bad news, isn't it, when the only news you get to talk about outside of COVID-19 turns out to be Brexit, which we'd all got bored with about a year ago.
Yes, it's about to become quite unboring, though, I think.
Well, what do you make of that? Let's kick off with that, because we haven't. And welcome, by the way, for the first time onto Zoom, so people can now see you in all your glory, as well as listening to you. What's your fear about what happens in 38 days then?
Well, my fear has been for some time, as you possibly know, I didn't take any part in the referendum or vote in it. My fear has been that we were making a very considerable mistake by not following the Norway option, that is to say, staying in the single market and chucking out all the political rubbish. And I'm sticking to that. I think that when you become what the EU calls a third country, that's somebody who's trading from outside, the consequences are wholly predictable, but could be absolutely enormous. And I've never understood why people didn't look more carefully at the Norway option. See had many attractions, and I still treasure a tiny hope that between now and December the 31st, somebody will dust it off and say, hey, why don't we do this?
Yeah. And what would you see as the advantage of the Norway option then?
Well, I say that the principal advantage of it is quite simple. You don't have any political control or direct legal control from the European Union. It's obviously a big neighbour. You have to pay attention to it. And if you want to live there, you join the single market and you stay in it, as they do, while, say, not having the political interference in their fishing grounds or their oil industry or any other things where it's none of the EU's business. And that always seemed to me to be the perfect compromise between the position we were in and the position that we're going to be in. And I still think so. And I'm just stood amazed at the way so many people have just never paid any attention to it or taken it up.
No. Well, most of the people that I've seen commenting over the course of the last, say, 24 hours or so, in terms of our listeners, are quite happy to leave without a deal altogether. Because I've always argued that in the end, surely we'll always be negotiating at some point with somebody about something. You can't sort of suddenly sign a piece of paper and expect nothing else to happen other than for trade to run very smoothly. You're kind of always going to be negotiating something, aren't you?
Well, I suppose so, but looking at this particular government, I don't anymore comfort myself with the idea that we must eventually reach a sensible compromise. I'm not at all sure that they understand how to do that, or indeed, in many cases, they actually know what would happen if they failed to do so.
Yes.
I don't think it will happen either, because it's a land of mystery. Once we leave the European Union and leave the single market at the end of this year, which we will in reality, a lot of people think we've left already, we haven't. Once that happens, and maybe half of Kent will be covered in lorry parks, and maybe there will be a more or less shutdown of large parts of our trade with the European Union, not of them sending stuff to us, but of us trying to get stuff to them, and the resulting chaos which follows. I just think that it's no one, ever since the stories of takeover by Dominic Cummings of the Leave campaign, and the replacement of what had been a campaign to re-establish British sovereignty with a campaign for the wildest notions of free trade, the whole Leave cause has been very different from the one which I thought I belonged to before the referendum happened, and that's one of the reasons why I parachuted out of it. I didn't like the look of what was coming, and I still don't.
But you presumably would still prefer to be out than in, wouldn't you?
Well, yes, but I don't think it's not necessary. As I say, Norway proves, Switzerland proves it in a different way. We couldn't negotiate that; it would take decades. But Norway proves there is a way of taking the economic advantages of the EU without taking the political interference. It's not perfect, but I absolutely promise you that what's coming after December 31st won't be perfect either. So that's not really the argument.
Well, I suppose not, but I mean, a part of the big part of the problem is that people have been speculating for weeks and months and years now about what terrors may await us. And generally speaking, on all of the things that they warned about before, they weren't right. So I tend to veer on the side that actually it will probably be a lot less bad than you think it's going to be, because up to now, all of the things that we were warned were going to happen and we're going to destroy the country and destroy the environment and destroy the economy haven't happened yet. And you're not allowed to say that's because we haven't left yet.
Well, in that case, they won't say that.
But you know what I mean, though.
Well, I know what you mean, and indeed, it would be a delight to me if the worries which my great friend and ally, the late Christopher Booker, expressed on this, who was one of the greatest experts on the whole European issue, wrote the book on it, and knew more about it, I think, than anyone else living. I'd be really pleased if his worries turned out to be unjustified. But I have to say, I think Christopher understood very clearly what was going on, and if he thought that the plunging out of the single market without, as we appear to be planning to do, was going to be a disaster, then I'm inclined to think that he might have had a point. All prophecy is dangerous, and he's now not around to redouble it because, alas, he died last year. But it is the case that he, who really understood this issue and had written many books about it, thought that leaving the single market and becoming a third country was hugely problematic, and I have to say I have to respect that.
And as far as the kind of the union is concerned, what are your thoughts about that? Because obviously one of the things that we are told today could become a problem is the Northern Ireland situation regarding freedom of movement of goods and services and all the rest of it. But also you've got Nicola Sturgeon up in Scotland, you've got the Welsh Assembly over in Cardiff, both kind of agitating, if you like, against almost all government policy now. And will there be a price to pay for Downing Street on that in terms of the way that the union will be maybe potentially broken up as a result of how we leave the EU?
Well, this has always been a crack into which the European Union could insert a lever, and the breakup of the United Kingdom was actually one of the consequences of our joining the European Union, which doesn't really like to have rival federations on what it regards as its territory. There was a huge competition between the Federation of the United Kingdom and the Federation of the European Union. But what the particularly Scottish independence is largely about is Scotland switching fealty from London to Brussels, and the whole creation of devolution, largely by New Labour, but not really fought on principle by the Conservatives, was a response to the loss of sovereignty of this country to the European Union over many years. I'm not sure that can be reversed. As for the position in Northern Ireland, I'm certain it can't be reversed, because what this country actually did in 1998 was sign a surrender to the provisional IRA, and which will ultimately come fully into force. And Northern Ireland is very much a provisional, to use an appropriate word, a provisional member of the United Kingdom. I don't think it can last.
We're just losing you a little bit there, Peter. But let's get off the subject of the European Union. Let's get back to the matters at hand, because over the course of the weekend there was some interesting stuff written about the testing procedures that are currently undergoing in the country, in terms of the fact that more and more people are being tested. We've got a figure of more and more infections. People saying it's alarming. Now we've got the biggest number of infections in the thousands since May. What we can say, though, is that an awful lot of the testing is responsible for an awful lot of the results that we're seeing, which is what you've always said anyway.
Well, yes, this morning I bunged in a question to the Department of Health saying, well, could you please give me the figures or the numbers of tests which have been taking place since late August for each day, the numbers which came back positive and the numbers which came back negative, and the others which were discarded and excluded for whatever reason. And I'll be very interested to see that. But I can't really believe that a jump in so-called cases that was recorded last night could happen without some sort of major change in the way in which this thing is being recorded. I expect strongly that the government has stepped up the amount of things to it.
Well, I think there's no doubt about that. But also, interestingly enough, they've now started to, or certainly some medical people have started to sort of weed out what's going on here. And they've started to echo your words, which are that, one, yes, there are more people being tested. Therefore, yes, there are more people testing positive. But equally, those people are not necessarily ill. And we know, for example, from the Leicester lockdown, that there were no additional hospital admissions, despite the fact that they had a rampant number of people testing positive. We also know that of the last, say, month or so, we have not had any numbers of deaths increasing or any numbers of hospital admissions increasing. So surely the government has to now put all of that into context.
Well, you would hope so. But the people who really put it in context, the large majority of the British media, particularly the BBC. You can listen to major BBC programmes, such as the Radio 4 Today programme, and you wouldn't get any sense at all that anybody working there had any idea that these were interesting questions. It doesn't seem to cross their mind that more tests mean more cases. It doesn't seem to cross their mind to wonder what a case means. I was supplied by a correspondent with a number of graphs last week showing the paralleling the number of tests and the number of deaths. There's no relation between them, and the number of people going to hospital is tiny. And so the whole idea of saying that a large number of tests means that we're on the edge of a terrible new outbreak of death and misery is simply false. But you wouldn't know it from reading many newspapers, and you certainly wouldn't know it from listening to or watching the coverage of the main broadcasting organizations in this country. And this is absolutely disgraceful. And I say to my fellow journalists, what is it that you're doing? Did you leave your brains somewhere? Can you remember where it was? And if you can't actually be basically skeptical and critical and mistrustful of government state, what are you doing in the trade of journalism anyway? You're not suited to it. I think this has been one of the greatest failures of journalism that I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah.
And a totally disgraceful one. I look forward next March to everybody in my trade congratulating themselves on what a wonderful job they did when they did nothing of the kind. The only awards they deserve are awards of shame.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Peter. I mean, I'm like you, similarly taken aback, because I would never normally be critical of my fellow colleagues and people that work in the business that we are both in. But I have to say that ever since really the referendum, I've been quite taken aback and staggered by the bias that's been shown by the BBC, which they're now admitting even amongst themselves, the bias that's been shown by Sky Television and even ITV in the form of Robert Peston, the idea that they are somehow anti-government and yet they don't ask the right questions. And you do wonder why that is, because they seem to have moved now from the list of deaths being the highest in the world and how terrible it all is, to now that they seem like encouraged by the fact that infections are up, like it's a good thing.
Well, I know. It is very difficult to explain, but I think I'm trying at the moment, I'm trying to write something about what exactly is going on. And I think the real problem is that quite a lot of people like being afraid. Quite a lot of people like handing over responsibility. They don't like taking it. And fear is a wonderful opportunity for doing that. If you're sufficiently afraid, then you've got an excuse to run to mummy. And basically, a large part of the population in this country has run to mummy. And mummy turns out to be Matt Hancock, which is not necessarily an attractive prospect for some of us. And that's what they've done. They've found that they don't really like being free. They don't really like being free to question. They don't really like having independent lives. They like being told what to do. And it is a minority of people who don't. I mean, this is the question. I know you disagree with me about this, and that's why I think we should discuss it. The question of these muzzles that people are being made to wear. Increasingly, with another case, which I only just saw on Twitter, a man who appeared, from all one could see, to have been behaving perfectly normally, being handcuffed in a supermarket car park by about 4 police officers for not wearing a muzzle. And the scenes in Victoria, in Australia, and particularly in Melbourne, when there was a small protest against this last Saturday, were absolutely appalling, especially when one remembers that the state of Victoria basically has the same legal and political system as we do. It's now something rapidly approaching a dictatorship in which the state prime minister is ordering people to stay at home for most of their lives and sending people round to burst into the homes of those who protect.
Yes, no, I saw the pictures from Victoria of the police officer seemingly putting a mask on a protester without their without their permission, effectively.
Yeah, well, this is. I said this is not about. It's not about health. This is about fear and power. And I think those moments illustrate this. And I do draw people's attention to the pictures which, in fact, my newspaper, to its great credit, originally published some years ago, of the prisoners at Guantanamo who'd just been unloaded from the plane, kneeling in chains in their orange jumpsuits. You look at those pictures, and what do you see? Those Guantanamo prisoners who were being held wholly unconstitutionally, extraordinarily, and still, to me, very wrongful behavior by the United States. What were they wearing, apart from the orange jumpsuits and the goggles and all the rest? They were wearing those little blue muzzles over their mouths. Can anyone tell me that anyone had heard of COVID when Guantanamo was set up? And they were there. They knew what they were there for. They were a symbolic gagging, and that's what they were wearing them for. And I think people should look at those pictures and wonder how it is that exactly the same pieces of of pale blue cloth have turned up now, and they're putting them over their mouths.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, funnily enough, I haven't checked out. I've seen the video on Twitter. I haven't actually looked at it of the guy being arrested in the supermarket. But I'm always slightly wary of the stuff that appears on Twitter without checking it out. Because, for example, the one of the guy who was being sort of manhandled on a train up north somewhere by a police officer who was complaining that he didn't want to wear a mask. Apparently, there had been a report, according to the police. Now, you could say to me, well, we don't believe a word the police say. But according to the police, there had been a report that this guy was spitting at people. Therefore, you could understand why they were on the train. Now, I had my first taste of it. You may be interested to know. Last Thursday, I took the train into work. I took the tube into work, and I walked through the ticket barrier with my phone, because my phone is my facial recognition scenario, which gets me through the barrier. And there were two police officers standing on the other side who said, "Excuse me, sir, do you have a mask?" And I said, "Yes, I do. I'll be putting it on when I get on the train." And one of them muttered as I walked away, "You should be wearing it in the station." To which I said, "Well, I'm not going to." And I just kept walking. And they didn't come after me. But as far as I know, there's no absolute law which says you have to wear one in the station. I'm quite happy to wear one on the train, but not on the platform.
Oh, I'm afraid you're dealing with an expert here. Alas, the law does now say that you should wear it in the station, except in Wales, where it's only on the train. You talk about the Merseyside episode, and the police did indeed put out two statements. One, that there have been reports of him spitting on other people, and others have been reports of him coughing. And I wrote to them on Twitter and said, which is it? I don't think I've had a reply.
Right.
It was interesting in the scene that was recorded was there was no sign of the officer reproaching the man for having coughed or spat over passengers, or even raising the issue. He was wholly concentrating on he was wearing the muzzle. And the other passengers, who, if he had been doing this revolting thing, would surely have been joining in on the side of the police officer, were not saying, "Oh, that disgusting man was coughing on the other passengers." They were saying to the police officer, "What exactly are you doing?"
Right.
So, although we haven't seen everything, I think so far it does look to me as if something very heavy-handed was going on. Remember, this is a police force which not very long ago was under severe criticism because it just doesn't bother with things like burglary and car theft, and no longer patrols the streets. Now seems to be joining in with immense enthusiasm in handcuffing citizens who will not wear face muzzles. I don't find that particularly reassuring.
No, I don't. No, I agree with you. I mean, I can't imagine a scenario whereby 3 years ago you and I could have had a conversation in a pub in which we would have said, "Oh, look, there's a guy coughing over there. You better call the police." It doesn't really make a lot of sense, does it?
No, it doesn't. It's a complete change in the nature of things. Talking to some friends the other evening about this, and one of them said, now, for large parts of this year, I've been afraid to go out in case I got in trouble with authority. This is an extraordinary law-abiding person, actually a former criminal lawyer,
right?
And very absolutely and totally against crime and not inclined to commit it. So suddenly becoming afraid of being picked up for something which has suddenly become an offence. It reminds me also of some of my trips, particularly to the People's Republic of China, when I went to Xinjiang to see what was happening to the Uyghurs, which is now a huge issue, wasn't much known about it. And you did feel, particularly in the city of Urumqi, a great sense of nervousness that whatever you were doing, although it was entirely legal and I was there legally, I haven't broken it, at any time, I didn't want to attract the attention of the police in case they decided that for some purpose of theirs, I was someone they could pick up. It was a similar sort of nervousness has now begun to creep in this country. Well, this country should not feel like the People's Republic of China. And half the point of being British is that you don't live under the circumstances where you have to be afraid of authority. Authority really should be afraid of the people. That's the only proper arrangement. And that's what's shifting now. People are becoming afraid of and far too obedient to arbitrary authority. You know the Milgram experiment, the great experiment where people were persuaded to give other people electric shocks because authority told them to do so. In a way, what's going on is this country is being subjected to a huge, great Milgram experiment in which the government is finding out just exactly how obedient we are. If they suddenly said that all COVID viruses floated at 3 foot 6 inches, or they'd probably say a metre above the earth, and we all had to go on our hands and knees, how many people would obey?
Yeah. Well, that's what I find staggering. And yet, I mean, we're out of time, so we can't get into it in a big way. But and yet, if there are enough of you and you wish to perform some act of civil disobedience, such as bamboo chaining yourself to some gates or a lorry or something to stop newspapers coming out, that's okay. You can do that.
I think it's the right sort of disobedience it is, yeah, otherwise not.
No, quite. Exactly. Peter, great to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed. And good to see you as well. Peter Hitchens on Zoom for the first time, a Mail on Sunday columnist, man who says, as I do, what has gone wrong with the people of this country? Because in the end, it's the people who run the country, not the government. And if people are actually genuinely frightened to go out because they're worried they might be breaking the law, then surely there's something wrong with that, isn't there? For heaven's sake, we need to get back to work. We need to get back into the city. We need to stop doing what we are told every single second of every single day, because the more that you do that, the more that you will be told what to do. That's the way it works. This is Talk Radio.
Talk Radio.
Loads more coming up, of course. We're going to have Ian Collins here at 1 o'clock. We're going to have Dan Wootton here at 4 o'clock. Coming up after the news, we're going to talk to Donald McLeod, owner of The Garage in Glasgow, entrepreneur, music promoter as well, of course. He's been fighting the good fight up in Scotland, trying to get some kind of compensation out of the government because the nightclub business has been totally forgotten. However, he has had some success. He's going to tell us about that. Also, the government in Scotland have now said that not only will they give some money to live music venues, but they will also in some way allow them to reopen as bars. The only problem is you're not allowed to listen to any music in Scotland for fear that you might get too excitable and start either singing, shouting, talking loudly, or God forbid, maybe even dancing. I mean, really? Really? We're talking about Scotland here. You know, most of the country staggers about most of the time half drunk, for heaven's sake. What's going on? It certainly was like that when I was there. Let's get some news headlines with Ross Pell.
Talk Radio. Half-hour headlines.
A man's been arrested on suspicion of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder following a series of stabbings in Birmingham city centre in the early hours of yesterday. West Midlands police are questioning a 27-year-old who was arrested at an address in the Selly Oak area of the city at around 4 o'clock this morning. The West Midlands Police and Crime Commissioner, David Jamieson, has spoken to Talk Radio from the scene of one of the attacks.
We're fairly certain at the moment that he appeared to be acting alone, but that again is something that will come clear in the police inquiries. And looking at some of the CCTV footage, as time goes on, it'll be the next days and weeks, I think further details will emerge.
A 23-year-old man died in the attacks, while a 19-year-old man and a 32-year-old woman remain in a critical condition. Police in Suffolk are at the scene of a reported shooting involving a school pupil near Ipswich. The incident is understood to have taken place just before 9 o'clock at Grange Farm, just outside Kesgrave. Kesgrave High School have tweeted to say police have informed them the incident involves one of their Year 11 pupils. Several surrounding roads are closed, with police asking people to avoid the area. The public inquiry into the Manchester Arena bombing has opened in the city, with its chairman promising to search for the truth. A minute's silence was held and the names of 22 people who died were read out. And Julian Assange's partner has been refused access to Downing Street to deliver a petition for press freedom. Stella Morris is campaigning against the WikiLeaks founder's extradition to the United States, which is being reviewed at the Old Bailey. The 49-year-old's facing 18 charges, including plotting to hack computers. Rebecca Vincent from Reporters Without Borders was also there to try and present an 80,000-strong signature petition to number 10.
The Trump administration's use of the Espionage Act could lead to Assange's conviction and a sentence of up to 175 years in prison. This would set a dangerous precedent for all journalists who publish classified information that is of public interest.
A look at the weather. Wet weather from Scotland will make its way down to Wales and the Midlands as we head towards lunchtime. Mostly dry for the rest of the UK, with highs of 20 in the southeast.
Across the UK, online, on DAB, and on your smart speaker. Late Night with Christo Fufas on Talk Radio.
Big topics, big opinions, big conversations, and a place to have your say. So phone Christo and let's put the world to rights.
Late Night with Christo Fufas. Weeknights from 10 on Talk Radio. Mid-morning with Mike Graham. Talk Radio. The Independent Republic of Mike Graham on Talk Radio.
Welcome back to the Independent Republic of Mike Graham right here on Talk Radio. Much for us to do between now and 1 o'clock, of course. Keep your calls coming in. We're going to take some very shortly. 0344 499 1000. We are, of course, the home of Common Sense. Now let's talk Common Sense with Donald McLeod, owner of The Garage in Glasgow. Several other venues, of course, as well. Music promoter too. Donald's been fighting the Scottish Government for a while to get some kind of respite from them because obviously he's had furlough money, but he's had no ability to open his business and make any money whatsoever. Bars have been opened, restaurants have been opened, but nightclubs have not. Donald's got some news for us, though, on that front. Plus, there's a new campaign to try and regulate people going out and listening to music so that illegal raves do not actually continue. Donald, very good morning to you.
Good morning, mate. How are you?
Yeah, very well. Thanks very much for joining us. Tell us, first of all, Donald, about how you got a little bit of light relief, I suppose you would say, in terms of some money being handed out by the government. What's that going to do for you? Do you know yet how much it's going to be?
Well, there's about 15 million to be split between nightclubs and other venues and other events. So we're waiting on the criteria coming through for that.
Right.
But that was quite good in that we put an awful lot of pressure onto the Scottish Government, basically asking Nicola, do you not like nightclubs? Do you not like pubs? And so the next day she made an announcement in our Watch with Mother special.
Right.
You know, these daily announcements that they do. A revolving door of Bluey Loos seemed to turn up.
Right.
But on the back of that, joking apart, it was very welcome intervention to hear it. But again, as I say, we're waiting on the detail. But then on the back of that, we had a meeting, one of these Zoom calls with Jason Leach, Scotland's chief medical advisor, who's never off the telly or on the radio, worse than me. And he turned around and he was saying he would open a door and he would welcome any sort of dialogue with the NTIA and other representatives of the licensed trade and how we can maybe get some safe opening for nightclubs. But I doubt very much it's going to be, the door's going to be fully ajar for at least another month to 6 weeks,
right,
given that, the cases seem to be going up and up, even though we don't know how strong these cases are, as you sort of looked in your show, there's hospitalizations and happening and people going on ventilators, which doesn't look likely.
No. Well, that's the problem, isn't it? Because, I mean, lockdown is now presumably still ongoing in Glasgow for 2 weeks, right? The numbers of people being hospitalised for this are minimal. And, of course, the numbers of people dying are in single figures. So it seems bizarre that they aren't taking more kind of positive action, to me. But also, I mean, you're not allowed to see, apparently you're not allowed to listen to music in Scotland.
I know, that's a demanding thing.
Right.
We're a nation of Glasgow's a city of music, apparently, according to UNESCO. We're known for our club culture.
Right.
But when you think back, to the big slogan of the referendum, the Scottish referendum, that it was hope over fear. Well, it seems like we have no hope, and we're full of fear, and become a nation of curtain twitchers and snitches.
Right.
There's no balance. You can go into Glasgow, there's a lockdown at the moment, and that looks as if it's going to be spread, but there's no music. I mean, the pubs that are open some of them are lying with their throats cut.
Right.
For some bizarre reason, they say that playing music will make you shout louder. No, I don't get it. Yeah, you go to Edinburgh, and some of the places I was in at the weekend had background music. So there is it's disproportionate in my view, and the guidance itself is all over the place. It's not firm enough. Local boards are allowed to sort of view it one way from another. It's their discretion. So there's no firm guidance, and no wonder people are confused, and no wonder people are getting sickened with it all.
Well, it doesn't help either when the council leader herself is caught actually going out with a load of people, not social distancing. I mean, that's a bit hypocritical, isn't it?
Yeah, well, definitely. I mean, Susan Aiken, and of course the Tory leader, the council leader, Thomas Kerr, he was caught, and I say that wiggling my fingers as well. But extended family, they're calling it.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's a terrible state of affairs that we're now in, where people are looking over their shoulder to see if oh, am I allowed to be here? Am I allowed to go out? It's absolutely disgraceful. And it's happening up down the length of the UK. And I think it's worse, this sort of curtain twitching and grassing your neighbour up. Worse or as bad as the economy it's taking a tanking. It's a terrible state of affairs.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, Peter Hitchens was just saying to me that he was talking to a friend of his, a criminal lawyer, believe it or not, who said, "Oh, I've been frightened to go out in case I'm going to be in trouble for doing something." I can't believe what's happening to this country. Why are people suddenly now in fear of, not only the disease, which doesn't seem to be very frightening at all, but also of the kind of, the police feeling their collar because they're listening to a bit of Michael Jackson?
I know. I have got no answer to that other than when people get into power, they like to remain in power and they like to force that power upon you, and for some reason, they do not want to get away from it. And it suits a lot of people if we're all sitting down cowering in our houses and hiding, and looking out the curtain. And it suits an awful lot of people and an awful lot of organisations. We've got to get away from that, and I'm sure we will. But over the next few weeks, I'm not confident that will be the case. But from my own point of view, I've had to repurpose the garage and the cat house as bars, which is great. I got the licence for, but people don't understand that I've had to do that because the furlough is winding down, and I'm either going to mothball my venues or close them for good. Can you imagine Glasgow without the garage?
That's incredible, isn't it? And I mean, this is not the first time. This is not the first time you've had to spend a great deal of money, I assume, because you had to do it. I seem to remember. Did you not put in some massive air conditioning system when the smoking ban came in?
Yeah, well, that might actually come to be of a benefit, because if we were going to ever open up as a club, and indeed it will help us in our repurposing as well, you're talking about increased air ventilation, and so we probably have the biggest draft inside of our club outside of Largs or Millport on the west coast of Scotland. But we're looking at all different ways of going forward. I just wish that the government were walking in the same path and the same way with us. It seems to be one step forward, two back. A staggering thing here is that I noticed in the Times yesterday in England, Oliver Dowden, the culture secretary, is talking about Operation Sleeping Beauty, in which he's going to do a feat out to help out theatres at Christmas, like the eat out to help out deal, cut price tickets, removing social distancing in some of the theatres, so people can have a Christmas. Well, ain't that great? Operation Pinocchio, I think it should be called.
I was going to say, does he know that that's a fairy tale? It's not actually true.
I know. It doesn't matter, as we might say,
exactly.
As long as discussions are taking place about reopening. But it should not just involve the theatres and the freeloading lovies and thespians from the arts. It should be involving clubs, nightclubs, live venues, because especially grassroots music venues, because they've never had it so hard, and they're falling by the wayside, disappearing, jobs are going. I mean, as I say, the economy is getting tanked, and the government's job should be stepping in, both governments or all devolved administrations, instead of living with no hope and plenty of fear, putting confidence back into the marketplace. I'm all hoping for this, but it doesn't look good in the short term.
Well, the trouble is they don't seem to understand that. I mean, I was listening to a guy talking the other day who does something similar to you, but he does it in London, and he was saying that basically his turnover last year was £4 million. He paid something like £800,000 in VAT alone to the Exchequer. I mean, they will soon find out, I'm afraid, in Scotland as well as in Westminster, that they've got no tax revenues coming in at all. And what are they going to do then? They're going to have to find the money from somewhere.
Yeah, well, that's it. I mean, our tax has been deferred, same as VAT. But when it comes round, say in March, it's funny enough, it's the date that they're all talking about possibly reopening. We're going to be clobbered with huge bills and the deferred VAT. But there's the Delta Group, UK's biggest nightclub operator. That's them slashing 10% of the 4,000 jobs for September. wait till the end of October, it's just going to go up and up and up. And you're right in saying the revenue from aviation, hospitality, and nightclubs, the nighttime economy, is dropping through the floor. Where's the money going to come from? They really have to get. There's no balance yet. They've got to get this balance right. As I say, I fear that's not happening. And whether it's in Scotland or the rest of the UK, it's got to. We need a strong economy. We could have a strong economy. We should be getting people back to work out there, you know. And there's plenty of ways of doing it. Wear a mask if you want to. You know, that doesn't bother me. There's so many rules and laws coming in, and it's all based in fear. And, you know, thankfully that's not matched by rising death count.
Well, it really isn't.
Well, there's rising death counts with other illnesses, I'm sure there is, with heart attacks, with cancer patients, people missing their appointments. That's just going to go up and up. It's went too far. I think we've fallen off the edge of that.
Yeah, I think so, and they don't seem to know how to get it back. Just one last question, Donald. You understand you've also got a campaign going to try and get, the shutting down of illegal raves organised so that people can actually go and do a proper night's entertainment, properly regulated, properly licensed by people like yourself.
Yeah, Freedom to Dance campaign is that's part of the NTIA's next strategy, and it was launched last week, and to encourage all party groups of MPs, MSPs to support the opening, the safe opening of nightclubs, because let's face it, we look after millions of people safely every year up and down the length of this country. We take details anyway. They're challenged up here in their age with challenge 25, and crime has went down. Now we've seen a massive rise of illegal raves, illegal gatherings, where there's no track and trace, where there's no the drugs are everywhere, and it'll not be long before there is a tragedy. Whereas in a nightclub, a regulated proper nightclub, where you can maybe have some sort of, where there's no social distancing but a reduced capacity, you can have thermal temperatures, hand sanitisation, masks, not mandatory, but more importantly, a duty of care for the customer and your staff in place. Seems like the sensible option. However, sensible options aren't the way forward, it seems these days.
No, it doesn't seem so. Well, listen, best of luck with it all, Donald. Thanks for talking to us again. Donald McLeod, owner of the garage in Glasgow. Lots of campaigning, lots of ideas, but the government, no ideas. Absolutely none whatsoever. All they say is, don't enjoy yourself, don't go out, don't sing, don't listen to music, don't talk loudly. You're talking Scotland here, Glasgow, for God's sake. This is Talk Radio.
Talk Radio. Welcome
back to the Independent Republic of Mike Graham, right here on Talk Radio. Let's go to the phones. We haven't spoken to anyone for a while. We need some common sense on this show. 0344 499 1000. Let's talk to Mike in York. Hello, Mike.
Oh, good morning. How you doing, Mike?
Very well indeed. What's going on up there in the world's most beautiful part of Britain?
Well, it's only a local call to you-know-who, so... And it's just liquid sunshine at the moment.
Fantastic. Can't say the same down here. What do you got for us today?
It's about quarters, and because I had lots of relatives and friends in the fishing industry, I didn't do it myself.
Right.
I get seasick easy. Quarters. What happened in the past was that quarters were dealt as they were in shares, and rich families. And I understand, and this is one of my friends who were in the industry. He even told me that Manchester United have a quarter, which. Perhaps some of your listeners can...
what, for fishing?
Yeah.
Really?
They're not, yeah. Now, I've no reason to doubt him, but you try and get freedom of information to find out who owns these quarters. And I can guarantee you one thing, it won't be those that goes out in trawlers.
All right. Okay, so what you're saying is that certain people are allowed to get fish and certain other people aren't?
Well...
Is that what you're saying?
What happening is the quota system, for some reason, and nobody could ever fathom out how they were handed out.
I thought it was all done on the basis of different nations rather than individual companies.
Oh, no. For instance, a Netherlands fishing company could have own fishing quarters of the UK.
Okay. Yeah, but would that not be part of the actual quota given to the Netherlands rather than given to an individual company?
No. And it's part of the...
Well, you're telling me something I've never heard of before, so I'll have to check it out.
Well, what I'm going to ask you to do is, do you know Paul Baldwin of the Express?
Paul who?
Paul Baldwin of the Express?
I don't.
Well, I would ask him with your connections to actually investigate it. But Another madness, as we all witnessed, was when you had to throw fish back.
Right.
And the quota system was as mad as that.
Yeah. No, I know. I mean, the problem with the fishing business in this country is that it's been worn down to such an extent that there's not enough British fishermen left to take up all the fish that the Europeans fish for. So we either have to restart the fishing business in this country, or we just have to get the rights to sell those quotas and those fishing rights to the European nations that want them.
No, absolutely not.
What do you mean, no?
Because you talk about slavery. What you're talking about is rich people, very rich people, trading in quotas. And the last person on the pecking order are the trawlermen that have to go out.
Right. Well, you're telling me something I've never heard of, so I don't even know if it's true. But, I mean, I'll take your word for it for the moment. But I don't know that that's the truth.
Please do. But I would say is from the 1st of January, there's no more trading in quotas. Every 100%
Why is that,
of
then?
fish... Well, because if you have quotas, you can't have somebody landing fish in the Netherlands and you don't know what the quota is. Do you honestly think, given what the Spanish did, reflagging illegally their boats, that they're going to tell you what they've caught?
Well, no.
Absolutely
But the
not.
point is that depending on whatever the deal is that is done, and I'm hoping there is no sell-off of the fishing rights and there's no kind of compromise on that front, what we will then have is a situation where we own all the fishing rights, and if somebody wants some, and if they want to have permission to fish in our waters, we may grant them that for a fee. That's what I think we should do.
No. Just look at Grimsby.
What do you mean, no? Why do you keep saying no?
Well, mainly, mate, because this is big money. Can you imagine?
Of course it's big money.
Imagine where the big money is going to...
Well, of course it's big money, but you get them to pay big money for the right to fish in the waters that we can't fish because we don't have enough fishing boats.
And what about conservation?
What about it?
And sustainability?
Oh, come off it. When was the last time you talked about that?
Me? I talked about it the other week.
Well, I mean, you can easily build that into the system and say these are the amounts you can fish, these are the times you can fish, this is the part of the year you can fish, and if you don't like it, get lost. Simple as that. So, Mike, listen, I think you should calm down, mate. Stop saying no to me. Let's talk to Peter in Bournemouth. Hello, Peter.
Oh, hi, Mike.
How are you? I'm very well indeed.
Fine.
What have you got for me?
Right. I don't know if you know that Matt Hancock was on another radio station this morning.
I think he was on lots of radio stations this morning.
Well, he was on the one particular. Anyway, I try to get onto this radio station because I've written to him a lot, and proper letters, and I hope reasoned letters, and emails, and of course you never get an acknowledgement, let alone a reply to these things. So I thought he'd already said he liked speaking to members of the public. Well, we know with politicians, they only like speaking when it's just before an election. But anyway, didn't get through. Can I just tell you the questions that I was going to ask? A lot of this has been repeated, but I'd like to get this off my chest, if you don't mind. First of all, I would like to know what the number of deaths were caused by COVID-19, not presumed or suspected deaths. I would also like to know what other causes of death, such as the flu, well, there have been a number of stabbings lately. We don't hear much about those.
Well, we heard about nothing else over the weekend, didn't we?
Well, I didn't, because to be honest with you, I just don't listen to the media very much anymore. And also, you've got the cancelled hospital appointments, operations, life-saving measures. And in relation to those, how much of those have caused deaths or will cause deaths in the future? I mean, I've seen a figure of about 200,000 missed appointments. I don't know if that's true or not.
I think it is true. I think there's been an awful lot of missed appointments, partly because there's not enough staff in other areas of the NHS because they've all been sucked into the COVID wards.
Well, it is the COVID NHS now.
Yes.
All right. The second point was about masks, or face nappies, as
Yes.
I prefer to call them.
Okay.
We have to wear masks or face nappies in shops.
Yes.
We don't have to wear them in cafes. You don't have to wear them in restaurants. And you don't, it seems, have to wear them when you go on protests. But you have to wear, the children or pupils in schools have to wear them to walk through corridors.
Yes.
But not when they're sitting in a class of about 35 or 40.
It's crazy, isn't it?
It is totally crazy. And the other thing I was going to say was, look, there is something called preventive medicine.
Yes.
Now, I want to get an appointment from my dentist for a checkup. I haven't had a checkup since May. I need 6 monthly checkups. All they're doing is emergency calls. That's all they're taking. This is supposed to be preventive medicine. And what's that like then in the actual medical side of the world, not just dentistry? how much preventative medicine is being ignored now,
Sure.
avoided now?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of people who tell me they can't get an appointment to see their GP because the GP's working from home.
Yeah. Well, yes,
which
that's
is
right.
extraordinary, isn't it?
Yes.
Shouldn't be allowed.
What really winds me up is you've got all these poor people that have died alone.
Yeah.
People haven't been going to their funerals. I think the government is praying for a second spike to justify the actions that they're...
Let's hope that's not the case, but you're absolutely right. I mean, whenever I talk to Peter Hitchens about this and I say, why are they not just changing the way they do things? He says, well, because they can't admit they got it wrong. But Peter, listen, great questions. If we ever get Matt Hancock on this show, we will ask him those very questions that you've just put to us. Let's go to another Peter who's in Gravesend. Hi, Peter.
Hello, Mike.
How you doing?
Not bad.
Good man. What can you do for me?
I just want to make some general comments about how the government I voted for is making me feel.
Yeah. Not good, I bet.
Well, it's the national psyche I'm worried about. They talk about bringing the country together. We've heard that. But it feels a lot more like just bringing everyone into line, which is a different thing, you know. They like to evoke a national spirit to deal with things, but they outlaw national pride. And it's very difficult to have, one without the other.
Yeah.
They seem to take the best of our natures, our tolerance, charity, civic behaviour, and they use them against us. It's emotional blackmail.
Yeah.
The masks are emotional blackmail, and if you've ever suffered emotional blackmail, you know it's very hard to forgive and get over.
Right.
And it's a strange psyche for everyone to be in, going into difficult times.
Yeah.
That's what worries me.
Well, what really worries me is the effect it's having on some people being those who are now frightened to go out, or frightened to go back to work, or frightened about getting arrested for not wearing a mask. I mean, there's a lot of fear out there.
Yeah, it's a very sorry... No one's happy. You just see that, we're not being brought together. We're being divided. They want us all in separate pods, and we're being divided and blackmailed. And I just don't think people will forget it.
Yeah.
Right.
Do you see any end to it, Pete? Do you see any end to it?
Well, I don't think they want to bring us out of... I think they want it to be this way. I mean, maybe they think it's a lesser of two evils going forward. Perhaps they know more than we do. But
I find that unlikely, to be honest.
The general depression. I mean, you just don't see... You walk around and people are just they're in their own bubbles.
Yeah.
It's just not healthy.
It really isn't, no. And that's just what I've been banging on about.
Yeah, going into difficult times, which they haven't hit yet, but going into difficult times, I worry the national psyche and how it will deal with it, being divided as we are. Because obviously they keep talking about the Second World War, and that was very much maybe a pull-together type of thing.
Yeah.
But it was a different country then.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Peter, thank you for the call. Peter in Gravesend making some very good points indeed about the fact that we are in this ridiculous place. The more you think about it, right, the more ridiculous it appears to be. My kids are going back to school this week for the first time since March, right? Now, they didn't do much over the course of the last 6 months. They didn't do their exams when they were supposed to do them. They're now being told when they do go back, they have to wear a mask in the corridor. They don't wear a mask when they go to school. They don't have to wear a mask on a bus necessarily, depending on which bus they're on. They don't have to wear a mask when they're sitting in a classroom, even though that's, I would have thought, a more likely place to catch COVID than actually walking past somebody in a corridor. I thought the original plan was that you could only catch it if you were within a metre of somebody who had it for 15 minutes or longer. Walking past someone in a corridor does not qualify for that. Neither, mostly, does walking around in a supermarket, to be honest, but then you're supposed to wear a mask to do that. It's very odd, isn't it? Very strange. Lots more to come. This is, of course, Talk Radio. It is the home of common sense. If you're not doing it already, follow us on Twitter and watch us on YouTube. We'll be back after this.
Talk Radio.
Good afternoon and welcome back to the Independent Republic of Mike Graham right here on Talk Radio. Fascinating show so far. Some very interesting calls Although if anybody could tell me what Mike from York was all about the fish quotas, I'd be very grateful indeed. He may find himself making his way into the Perry Awards for that one. But we will look it up, we will sort it out, we will try and find the truth, because that's what we do here at the Independent Republican, Mike Graham. I've been accused by somebody called Lorraine of hiding from a particular story about Piers Corbyn getting arrested again. I didn't know he had been arrested again, to be honest. I'm certainly not hiding from it. But if he did get arrested, then he was probably arrested for doing the same thing he was arrested for last time, which shouldn't surprise him, should it? And Extinction Rebellion, which you say I have only had good things to say about, is entirely incorrect. I slagged them off earlier on. Extinction Rebellion is riddled, apparently, according to them, with left-wing agitators from the Trotskyite field and from the Socialist Workers' Party, because when they first decided to chain themselves to various places, do you remember when they had that problem in Canning Town atop the train, and they got pulled off the train and got a good kicking from the people who actually wanted to go to work? We were told at that point, oh, they don't really in Extinction Rebellion, they're not really with us, they're just kind of independent Extinction Rebellion types, which is exactly what they said about the lot that turned up outside of the print plants up and down the country, until they then rescinded that and decided, oh, actually, I'll tell you what, they're all part of Extinction Rebellion because we must stop all newspapers coming out, apart from the Guardian and the Daily Mirror, which is also published by the people that publish the Daily Express. It's all a bit confusing for the Extinction Rebellion nutters. They can't work out who's left, who's right, who's they're supposed to lorries are supposed to lie in front of. For heaven's sake, I'd have just driven over them, but of course I'm only joking when I say that, but there we are. Sometimes we make jokes on this show, unlike other radio stations where you're not allowed to have any fun. We have a lot of fun here at Talk Radio. 0344 499 1000. Coming up in this hour, Howard Cox is going to join us, because guess what? The cyclists are getting a good deal against the motorists who are getting a bad deal, because councils up and down the country are putting in all manner of ridiculous cycle lanes, bollards, they're closing off streets all over the place, simply because they've got some free money coming from the government, and the government think that they're misspending it, because Grant Shapps is telling councils to stop abusing the £250 million fund for green transport revolutions. How about you put a halt, Mr. Minister of Transport, to the green transport revolution altogether? 0344 499 1000. You're listening to me, Mike Graham, on the fastest growing radio station on the planet. It is, of course, Talk Radio.
Mid-morning with Mike Graham. Talk Radio.
Now, if I were a betting man, I would say that if you work for a local council in this country, you will take both hands and grab any amount of money that you can get your hands on, particularly if it comes from central government, and you'll do with it what you like. I can tell you of loads and loads of examples of misspent public funds which are being spent on things that most people don't want it spent on. I've told you, I think the last time we spoke about this, that down in Hastings they're spending something like 350,000 quid to do away with a load of parking spaces in order so that they can actually create a proper widened pavement. Now, if any of you know Hastings very well, it's already got one of the widest pavements in the entire world, because it's right down by the seafront. And it's very, very wide indeed. Why they need to widen it even further at the expense of parking places so that people can't park their cars, so they can't go shopping, so that businesses can't make any money, is beyond me. But let's talk to Howard Cox, co-founder of the Fair Fuel UK campaign, of course, to find out why Grant Shapps is getting all hot and bothered about it. Howard, a very good afternoon to you. Welcome.
Hello, Michael. How are you?
Yeah, very well indeed. I mean, I dare say your appearance on my show will once again result in the usual torrent of abuse that you get from the cycling fraternity. But I mean, this is proof positive, is it not, that we are being discriminated against as motorists by local councils who are quite happy to take our parking fee money and then make it possible for us to park in even fewer spaces because they need more cycle lanes.
Well, these local authorities are totally clueless. I mean, they're under what I call emotive pressure from cycle lobbyists. You mentioned the Extinction Rebellion and other well-financed green groups, which are mainly celebrity-based. Yeah. They're mostly, dare I say it, white, middle-class, middle-aged, or something like between 20 and 45, fit young people who, for some reason or another, have this incredible hold over local authorities. And Grant Shapps has been lobbied by a lot of MPs, and I've been talking to MPs for the last 2 weeks about this. And there's a lot of local groups, disabled groups, pollution activists, believe it, and motorists who have lobbied their local councils, their local MP, and they hit Grant Shapps very hard and say, what the bloody hell is going on?
Yeah. Well, exactly right. 250 million quid. I mean, I'm not sure that any of us actually said that we should have a green transport revolution. I don't remember voting for that. I don't remember the government running that as part of their election manifesto pledge. But, given that they have got a so-called green transport revolution going on, surely they should have better control over how that money is spent. I was trying to get out of London on Friday, right, to head down to Sussex. Now, as you can imagine, in southeast London right now, if you know, is a complete and utter car park. You cannot go anywhere, right? So I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll nip up round the back of Greenwich and go up to the top of Blackheath, right? Now, yes. I didn't realise that what they've done there is they've blocked off all of those streets, right? They've put plant pots out to make it impossible for you to drive up to Blackheath. Now, I don't know what you're supposed to do if you live there, but I also don't know what you're supposed to do if there's a fire in a house there and the fire engine can't get through because of all these blockages.
Well, this is what's happening. And the irony of all this is these planters, as they're called, these giant planters, are being vandalised as well.
Yeah.
The whole thing is a mess. The issue it's a really big issue because there's no urban road user transport strategy. It's just simply, if you've got the loudest voice, and that at the moment seems to be those dressed in lycra, they're the ones influencing policy in London. And unfortunately, Sadiq Khan's getting away with it. And the whole of this, there's no consultation whatsoever. No stakeholders, the haulage industry, delivery vans, and of course, you quite rightly said, the emergency services are actually, it's risking lives. Yeah. They're being blocked. They can't get through these roads.
Well, indeed. And also the traffic is so bad now as a result of all of these roads being closed off that even in the main roads, conservatively speaking, you've got ambulances, you've got fire engines, police cars, you can't get through. It's just absolute mayhem.
Yes, and it's backfiring on the cyclists because it's not helping them or pedestrians, because especially those disabled pedestrians and people, who are blind, for example, these planters are straddling parts of the pavement and people are hitting it. It is a complete and utter chaos. And Grant Shapps, I applaud him for doing something about it, but is he doing it too late? Is he doing it quick enough? And really, this 250 million should be held back from all local authorities until they actually allow to reduce congestion, reduce pollution, have policies for those sorts of things, not just for the sake of cyclists having a free rein.
Also, during the times that we are currently in, where we're trying to get people back into the high street, we're trying to get people back, if they're not able to shop in the cities, at least let them shop locally. And you know as well as I do, Howard, that by far and away the biggest problem for most people is when they do go out shopping, where on earth can they park? It's why they all got driven to the big supermarkets in the middle of nowhere, because they've got free car parking. But, the idea that you go to a little village somewhere in, I don't know, Shropshire, but there's nowhere to park is ridiculous.
Well, I'm coming up to London tomorrow from Heart of Kent. I live in just south of Tunbridge Wells, and I decided to drive up. But I just checked. I rang up a friend of mine who lives in London. I said, "Is my car parking spot usually? This is a pay parking spot. I'd probably spend 30 quid just to park there for the day."
Yeah,
that closed.
Oh, really?
It's closed because of social distancing issues. That's what it says on the sign outside it. So
why do you need to social distance in a bleeding car park?
Well, here we go. Mike, you see here lots of weird things on here, and I'm afraid this is what's happening with local authorities. They're actually cutting off their face, spite their face, should I say?
Yeah.
Simply because it's an income. This is a local authority car park, and this is an income stream, and it encourages people to come up the safest way possible in terms of inside a car rather than on public transport.
Yeah.
What's going on?
Well, Christo Fufas, who's on again tonight at 10 o'clock, he did a public a freedom of information request to Lambeth Council, because that's where he lives, and it turns out that they collected something, I think I'm right in saying, like £600,000 worth of parking fees and fines from people who were actually legitimately allowed to park on residential streets with residential permits, but the reason that they fined them all was because they hadn't renewed their permits, right? But they hadn't renewed their permits because there wasn't anybody at the council who could do it for them during the lockdown. But never mind, they just fined them anyway.
You couldn't write this in a Yes Minister sketch,
I know.
You? I mean, the point is, we are sort of making a little bit flippant, but this is so serious now. London is empty in terms of, a friend of mine went to have a meal in the West End yesterday. He said he couldn't park anywhere, but there were no cars around either. There was no congestion, and and the whole thing. And he, of course, had to pay the 30% increase in the congestion charge.
Yes.
And again, what's happening here? There's no consultation with stakeholders, with local businesses, with residents, high streets, all the various stakeholders that rely on transport working effectively in our cities.
Yeah, it really is quite extraordinary. And I was talking to a restaurant-owning friend of mine the other night, and he was saying to me that not only is there now pressure coming from the councils on things like business rates, but there's also pressure coming from private landlords. I know this is a separate issue, but the powers that be, if you like, are absolutely not helping businesses to recover and to get through this. They're absolutely penalising them for staying in existence.
And the whole thing is ridiculous, because we understand this is a green revolution and a new period for cyclists and pedestrians. But what they're doing is moving traffic congestion elsewhere.
Yeah.
Pollution has increased. High streets, as you say, shops are struggling. And virtually, well, I said it just now, parking spaces are disappearing at the rate of knots.
Yes, it's absolutely remarkable, isn't it? And as far as your campaign's going, Howard, against the congestion charge, tell us a little bit about that, because I know you've been doing some work on that. What's going on?
Yeah, I know, and it's one of our problems is, and I mentioned the last time I was on your show, the government served up on a plate to Sadiq Khan his ability to use emergency powers to put up the price of anything he wants to, anytime he wants to, and no judge, and I've spoken to two barristers, and the barristers have told us that no judge will fight against the emergency power legislation. But I've issued a freedom of information request, which I'm waiting for a response. TfL have come back and extended that response because they said they need to answer it under environmental legislation.
Oh, yeah.
But we've asked the question, where can we see, and I do it under GDPR regulations, in other words, confidentially, I would like to see the 14,000 emails he received in 7 days, giving him the right to increase it by 30%.
Right.
At the moment, the silence is deafening. So we are working on this very hard and watch this space. And a lot of newspapers are waiting to hear the response, and they want to go big on it.
Yeah, well, I think we'll be doing the same, Howard, so do keep in touch with us. Thanks very much indeed. Howard Cox, co-founder of the Fair Fuel UK campaign. We'd love to hear from anybody out there who has had their street somehow blockaded in some way, shape or form by the local council, or indeed sort of sliced up and diced up into the point where, you can't park there anymore because we need to put a cycle lane in, really. I mean, temporary cycle lanes are popping up everywhere. We've got, planters, if you call them that. I would call some of the councillors planters, to be honest, plankers as well. And the bottom line is that they're trying to restrict and make it more and more difficult for people to drive cars and vans. And the point is that more and more people are delivering things to more and more places because more and more people are shopping online. Now, you can't tell me that the fact that people are shopping online is not creating more congestion, because it is. If you buy 5 things in a week from an online purchase, more or less very likely that all of those 5 things will be brought to you individually in 5 separate vans on 5 separate journeys. So it makes no sense to me whatsoever, and I'm not just talking about London here, I'm talking about everywhere, to reduce the size of the roads when the numbers of traffic of vehicles on the roads are actually going up. The maths doesn't work that way, does it? 0344 499 1000 is the call you need to make. And you can also text us, of course, to 87222. That costs you 25p plus your standard network rate. Start your message with the word talk. And you can find us on Twitter as well, at Talk Radio. We'll take more of your calls coming next.
Talk Radio.
Welcome back to the Independent Republic of Mike Graham, right here on Talk Radio. Lots of you want to talk to me. I want to talk to lots of you as well. Many more things going on today, of course. We've got Scotland's First Minister talking now, Nicola Sturgeon, about the lockdown. As we have released ourselves from lockdown, have we released the virus? Or we have released the virus? Well, she keeps saying things like that. However, as we heard from Donald MacLeod, the leader of the council in Glasgow doesn't seem to agree. Doesn't seem to think it's that difficult or dangerous to go out, mix with a load of people in a bar, not social distancing. Nothing will probably happen to her, I wonder. But meanwhile, you can't open a nightclub and you can't play any music, for heaven's sake. Let's talk to Phil in Milton Keynes. Hi, Phil.
Good morning, Mike.
Good morning. What can I do for you?
Yeah, there's, this epidemic. There's an actual, pandemic. There's an epidemic in this country of lack of common sense.
Right.
Is there a drug we can inject people with?
Well, I don't know. I mean, just tell them to listen to this show and maybe they'll wise up. But it is getting ridiculous, isn't it?
Well, I actually do feel that, actually. But after a weekend without your show, I have 2 days of going with withdrawal symptoms.
Well, listen, I'm very happy to welcome you back into the fold.
Yes. No, I tell you, the key word that keeps on popping up this morning with all these conversations was context, which I think is a very good word to apply here. I mean, this ridiculous business once again of wokedom over Darwin. I mean, can I just remind these people that it was because of our imperial past that enabled them to have these wonderful colleges, like Oriel College and these magnificent colleges here in Cambridge and Oxford, all the beautiful architecture, our health service, our science, our technology, everything that they enjoy today is all born from our imperial past.
Yes.
Now, if they object to that, then, do one and go somewhere, some place like Saudi Arabia or the North Pole or somewhere else, but don't complain about it. If it wasn't for our imperial past, they would not have received a great education. They would never have been living in a country that is the creator of democracy, modern democracy.
Yes.
All these things they seem to forget. We talk about biting the hand that feeds you. It's disgraceful. It's a concept, but I just don't understand how anyone can be so ungrateful. It's a bit like if you invited me over to lunch, to an evening meal, and then I started complaining about, you didn't put too much thought.
Well, exactly. But also, it's not as if there's no recognition of the past being, in some people's eyes troublesome, because our history is very checkered, as is everybody's history. But as we were talking earlier to William Clouston from the SDP, why not highlight some of the checkered history of other countries as well? It's not just our country that had a problem with various pieces of our past.
I mean, really, it beggars belief what these people are about. Life, for goodness, just enjoy it, all the wonderful things of this country. It's one of the most amazing countries in the world.
Right. Well, where would we be without Charles Darwin? I mean, if you want to go blow up the, the Galapagos Islands as well, so that nobody can go and look at them.
I mean, honestly, it just leaves me flabbergasted. But these people need a good something to make them wake up. Because they really. It's beyond me, Mike. I just cannot understand it. How they can be so damn ungrateful. They're sitting in their lovely little cosy house. That cosy house they have was born from a system that provides capitalism. That will enable them to buy a house, able to go and put food on the table, and and clothe their kids and buy nice furniture, sit down in front of a 56-inch TV, whatever they watch. All these things.
But most of them are all the kids of privilege anyway. I mean, I saw a story at the weekend about one of the kids they arrested in New York for smashing up a load of shops, right? Turns out he's the son of one of the wealthiest people in America. Because he's got nothing to worry about. He's quite happy to be an anarchist because he knows he can go retire back to his dad's mansion lavishly and live like a king. It's unbelievable. Phil, good to hear from you again. Thanks very much indeed. And I'm sorry that you didn't manage to get through the weekend without hearing my voice. Although I was on Bob Mill's show, I think you'll find on Saturday, ranting about those idiots from Extinction Rebellion. The sort of, once again, the privileged few, the sons and daughters of the very, very well-off and well-cushioned and upholstered middle class in the shires of this country. Let's talk to Edward, who's in London. Hello, Edward.
Hi, Mike. How are you?
Very well, sir. What can I do for you?
So you were talking to Howard about the cyclists getting their own lanes and all these privileges from the councils. And I'm a cyclist and also drive a car from time to time.
Okay.
So I'm a road user either way. Personally, a cycling lane is a good way to separate the cyclists. But my question is this. If cyclists get these privileges and their own lanes, should they contribute to the maintenance of the roads by paying some sort of road tax to help out with the maintenance and creation of these things?
Unfortunately, if you ever ask that question to any sort of, rampant cyclist groups, of which there are many on social media, they will all say, but the road tax isn't about anything to do with paying for the road. It's all about emissions, and we don't make any emissions, therefore we don't have to pay any road tax, which is technically correct. But I would suggest what they should do is certainly have some kind of registration, which would involve them being at least recognised in case they have an accident, in case they drive dangerously, in case they go through red lights, as we do when we drive cars.
Yeah, that would be the point of insurance then. In fact, that's what they should do. But
yes, absolutely right. But I mean, the trouble is, never the twain shall meet, Edward, because cyclists believe that they have every right to do what they do. And they don't actually see that when the cycling rules were made, it was probably 200 years ago, But now you don't just have one guy going down the old Kent Road on a penny farthing. There's thousands of them.
That's why.
I don't
know.
How do you find cycling? How do you find cycling in London? Don't you think it's a bit dangerous?
Oh yes, I was petrified initially. I go really slow and let people overtake. But I try to keep the quiet road. To the quiet road because It's okay until I get used to it, but it's the easiest way to get around right now. And it was great during the lockdown because there were less cars.
Yes,
so
that's
that
true.
fantastic
Do you wear
for me.
lycra, Edward?
Like what?
Lycra, you know, that tight-fitting clothing that our cyclists like to wear.
No, I look
Thank
like
God
a
for that.
land whale, so no.
Yeah, thank God for that, Edward. Well played. See, Edward's the kind of cyclist you can have a reasoned conversation with, right? He doesn't start screeching at you that you're a mad polluter killing people like some of these cycling kind of fraternity types do. Let's talk to Mark in Bristol. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Mike.
How
Good
you
afternoon to you.
Good afternoon. I can tell you're going to moan about the traffic in Bristol because Bristol's a nightmare, isn't it?
Well, Bristol, like Sad Khan in London, is, I mean, we have a nightmare down here, as you know.
Yes.
Sorry, a nightmare down here. He's closed off the centre of Bristol to everyone. Not even Royal Mail vans are allowed in.
Goodness me. So how are you supposed to get your post delivered?
Well, I've got contracts with Royal Mail, so I know how it's being done. But basically, the vans have to go to certain points.
Oh, yeah.
Where they meet, postmen with these little red trolleys.
Oh, I've seen those, yeah.
And we've got to literally deliver them to those, and they've got to walk them in. That's the only way we can get them in. You got like Tesco's Express, for instance, in the centre of Bristol. They pay a fine every time their lorry goes in to take the goods in. Yeah,
unbelievable. I mean, what are they expecting people to push things around in wheelbarrows or something? Go back to the 19th century?
Well, it's absolutely, it's a big, massive step backwards. We've now got 3-lane cycle lanes. 3 lanes.
Really?
What used to be a dual carriageway is now reduced down to just 2 lanes of traffic instead of 4. So we've got 2 lanes of traffic. On the other side of the dual carriageway, we've got 2 lanes for bicycles running alongside the purpose-built cycleway, which is on the pavement.
That's ridiculous. And how many cyclists are there in Bristol? Do you have any idea? I bet they're empty half the time, aren't they?
Well, no, hang on, because last Thursday I saw 2.
This is the trouble, right? I mean, in London, it is a bit mad at certain times of the week and at certain times of the day. But for most of the time, there's nobody in these cycle lanes. And also, funnily enough, I was standing waiting to cross the road the other day in the Old Kent Road, which is quite a big, a busy road. Sorry, not the Old Kent Road, Whitechapel Road. And there's a cycle lane behind me, and I was standing between the cycle lane and the road. This cyclist comes down the road, not in the cycle lane, tells me to get out of the road. Shouts at me.
Yeah, but they want the cycle lanes and they want the road.
And the road, yeah. I mean, what's the point? You know, unbelievable, isn't it?
Well, the reason for my call was that TfL are about to close off 50 bus lanes. Now, these are within the London area.
Right.
These are 50 bus lanes where you have times during the day where you can actually take a car into the bus lane.
Yes.
Yeah? Because confusingly in London, you have quite a lot of bus lanes where you can drive into the bus lane to reduce congestion.
Yes.
Yeah? Well,
some of them have times on them, don't they?
Correct.
Yeah.
That's not happening now. They're about to close 100 miles of bus lanes.
Right.
And in total, there's about 50 odd bus lanes.
Blimey.
Now, I'm pretty sure I actually copied you in on the tweet.
Yes, I think I've got it here in front of me. Yeah, I see it now.
Yeah. So that'll actually give you,
Well, I'll tell you what else I've noticed is I know some bus lanes around where I am, sort of southeast London, they've changed the usage time. So one of them used to go from 4 till 7 in the evening. It now goes from midday until 7 in the evening, which means that if you didn't know that and you were used to using it, you'll now get fined.
Oh, yeah. We've got a bus lane on Fishponds Road in Bristol, whereby part of it is timed. You can go in at certain times, and a section of about 200 metres, and guess where the camera is? You're not allowed to go into it, and then it goes into a timed lane. So we're that one out.
Unbelievable. Listen, Mark, very good information. Thank you very much for bringing it to us. I've also got a great one here that's been sent in from another listener. A section of the Brighton seafront cycle lane is to be removed following a consultation and discussion with Brighton and Hove buses about bus journey times and congestion. Well, guess what? If you close off the road to cars, it's going to get more congested. People are not going to stop driving, you complete planks. Let's get some news headlines. Here's Ross Powell.
Talk Radio. Half-hour headlines.
A 17-year-old boy has been arrested following a shooting in Suffolk. The victim, a 15-year-old boy who was on his way to school, has suffered serious injuries and is being treated at Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge. Suffolk police say they're working with schools throughout the county to make sure everyone feels safe when schools finish for the day this afternoon. West Midlands police insist they worked as quickly as possible to identify the main suspect after a series of stabbings in Birmingham in the early hours of yesterday. As the knifeman remained at large, it took officers 15 hours to release CCTV images of the person they believed had carried out the attacks. In the early hours of this morning, a 27-year-old was arrested. Former Met Police officer Chris Hobbs has sympathy, though, for the police as they investigated the crime.
You had other things going on. You had huge fights at the Arcadian Centre as well. Police had to deal with reports of shots being fired. A complete nightmare for police officers having to deal with a scenario like that.
WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange has appeared in the dock at the Old Bailey in the latest round of his fight against extradition to the US. The 49-year-old, who has been in high-security Belmarsh prison for 16 months, is wanted over the publication of hundreds of thousands of classified documents in 2010 and 2011. Crowds gathered outside the court at the start of the hearing, among them the fashion designer Dame Vivienne Westwood, who says Mr Assange needs to be set free.
It's terribly, terribly important to save him because he's a symbol. And if he goes, we've got Armageddon because the world is in turmoil and nobody knows the truth.
And the government's being accused of a treacherous betrayal over reports it's planning to rip up the Brexit withdrawal agreement. The Financial Times says Boris Johnson is planning new legislation that would override key parts of the deal, although ministers insist they're not moving the goalposts. A look at the weather. There will be some rain over western Scotland and the north of Wales this lunchtime. Most of England should remain dry, though, through the afternoon. Highs of 20 in the southeast.
Across the UK, online, on DAB and on your smart speaker. Drive with Dan Wootton on Talk Radio.
We'll have the breaking news of the day and the biggest newsmakers combined with feisty political debate and A-list guests.
Drive with Dan Wootton, Monday to Thursday afternoons from 4 on Talk Radio. Mid-morning with Mike Graham. Talk Radio. The Independent Republic of Mike Graham on Talk Radio.
Welcome back to the Independent Republic of Mike Graham right here on Talk Radio. Ian Collins will be here, of course, at 1 o'clock. Just before that, he'll come in and tell us what's going on his show. Dan Wootton back on Drive from 4. Loads going on today, throughout the day here on Talk Radio, including many more of your calls as well. We'll try and get some more in before the end of the hour. Right now, though, it is that time. You might be sending your kids back to school even as we speak, or they may even have gone back to school even as we speak, but we're still doing a bit of homeschooling because some of my children certainly are still not at school yet. They're going back on Wednesday, and I've got to say, homeschooling has become such a success that we thought we'd just keep doing it anyway because it's kind of interesting. You learn about stuff you didn't know much about. Now, it turns out that today we're going with a little bit of a newsy feel because apparently it turns out that Andy Warhol's 1985 print of Queen Elizabeth II is going to be auctioned at Christie's in London, and of course Jackson Pollock's painting The Red Composition is also going on for sale in New York. There's going to be millions and millions of pounds made by the sale of these two paintings, and we thought who better to talk to than Alex Proud, entrepreneur and also owner of Proud Galleries here in London. Alex, a very good afternoon to you. Welcome.
Good afternoon to you, although I've got to say my experiences of homeschooling sound far worse than yours.
Listen, I'm not claiming that I've done anything good by homeschooling people, in particular my own children, but what we have done here is every day at 12:30 after the news, we've covered all sorts of interesting things like electromagnetism, the northern lights, we've looked at the cycles of the moon, we've looked at how electricity works, we've done all sorts of really interesting things, so it's quite nice to actually talk about something a bit artsy, really.
Fabulous, excellent.
Now, Andy Warhol is a guy that I actually used to see on a regular basis because I lived in New York in the 80s, and he used to just walk around the city, as a lot of celebrities did in those days, because New York was a place where nobody really noticed. They didn't care. I used to see people like Carly Simon walking down the street, or, Burt Reynolds, and I used to see, I once stood behind Andy Warhol in a queue for the cinema, but I can't remember what the film was.
Well, I mean, I think it's sad, that sort of, because London when I first moved to London back in sort of the early 90s, I kind of got the back end of that. I remember I lived in a sort of 6th floor dive in Hampstead. There were still dives in Hampstead back in those days.
Yeah.
They don't
I
exist
grew up
anymore
in one.
And you still see everyone walking around then, and no one hassled anyone, and it was rather lovely. And you go to the pub and they'd be there, and that kind of world has rather disappeared because everyone's so rarefied and up their own that we never see anyone anymore,
Yes.
which is a shame.
It is a shame. It's far too expensive for the likes of you and I now to even afford to buy a garage there, never mind a house. But I mean, he's a fascinating character, Warhol, because he sort of came from quite humble beginnings. I think in Pennsylvania, he became this kind of, I suppose, poster child for, you know, pop art, didn't he? I mean, there were a few others like him, but he was the one that everybody would be able to name.
Yeah, and I think it's particularly interesting because, you know, it obviously precludes the culture that now dominates Britain and many other countries, whether it, you know, of instant fame, of all the TV shows that exist to make unfamous people famous for 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And this all predates that. And it's quite interesting in a way because, you know, obviously that was in the 60s, and he talked about that concept of 15 minutes of fame, and he was obsessed with the media and how it presented people in many forms. And obviously he did everything from film to art to silk screen prints. He was multi-talented. And yet we don't then see that world come into existence, till Britain's Got Talent and everything else starts in the late 90s or mid-90s, doesn't it, where we start to see that world. And now we live slam bang in the middle of it. You know, I mean, he died back in 87.
Right.
You know, and I wonder what he would have made of it all, because this was, I suppose, his fantasy world, this world where anyone from any background can become famous, and it tends to be for not much longer than 15 minutes before they disappear again.
I mean, one of the things I really noticed when I was living in the States was that there was this fascination with fame in a way that we haven't had it here, in the sense that you could be at a party and you could be with anyone who was there that was famous for any reason. You know, somebody might be there because they were a mass murderer, but they'd get invited to the party because they were famous, you know, and they'd come out of prison now. Or somebody else who was famous for having an eating disorder, or somebody else who was a famous actress or a model, you know. But as long as you were famous, they didn't care what it was that you were famous for.
Well, I think, you know, and it's strange because, you know, I think that world is fascinating because it's obviously when disciplines sort of cross over and filmmakers meet photographers, meet artists, meet models, meet, you know, whoever, or as you said, meet criminals. And we saw that a little bit, recently. It was being reported about the Krays and all their contacts with various lords. There was a book that came out last month, I can't remember it, all about how much the Krays got invited to the lords to meet various conservative lords. You know, and that world is fascinating, cross-pollination. And I mean, again, going back to sort of the early 90s, the strange thing was, I'm sure you remember this with London back then, was because there were far fewer places to go out to, you know, that London hadn't exploded into Shoreditch and everywhere else with thousands of wonderful restaurants. And that is a great thing. I mean, I love the fact that London has a much wider selection of places to go to. But back then in the early 90s, there were only a few bars, and there was only, you know, the Atlantic, the one nightclub that stayed open late, and everyone went to those places. So London used to be more like that. And I don't know, we always look back and think we've missed something. And because I think you're right. I think there's something quite joyous when you see that world of creativity. And I think that's why London exploded in the 90s, because we had that in London for the first time, and it created a really unique feeling, which I think has gone a little bit now because London's just so huge. There's just so many places to go, and you know, someone could be out in Shoreditch, someone else is in Soho, someone's in Chelsea, and now I'm down in South London. I mean, it's wonderful down in South London. It's completely changed, and it's a positive thing. But you miss something, and I think that like you said, New York in Warhol's era, and London when Cool Britannia happened in the 90s, you get these unique moments when arts cross-pollinate and create something really wonderful.
Yes, absolutely right. And of course, he had a brief and sort of reasonably good foray into the musical world. He had the Velvet Underground, who he kind of adopted, who became very well known and are still sort of seen as a bit of a cult band. He designed Sticky Fingers, that famous Rolling Stones album cover with the actual zip on the trousers, which I think won a Grammy Award. You know, he was a very switched on guy. And I mean, I'm just looking to see when his last painting sold. 2013, he had a painting sell for $105 million. So, you know, it's not bad, is it?
It's extraordinary. I mean, I suppose when we get to those massive prices that are now made, we need to bear in mind that, and this is quite, most of that is utterly corrupt. money from places like Russia and the Middle East that it's trying, and it goes into a bonded warehouse in Switzerland, and no one ever sees the damn thing. And actually, it's quite disgusting, and it's quite ugly and horrible, and it's something I think that is awful. Because obviously at that level, museums can't afford to buy these things anymore. This is just an oligarch who is probably ripped the hell out of his own country, and he has to park the money in a safe place. So you get the very greatest stuff, like people like Warhol or Liechtenstein or whatever else, and it goes to these insane amounts of money. But I don't think that's a particularly good thing. Although it's great if it keeps people interested, and if the press reports it, and some young kid somewhere suddenly becomes interested in art, well, then that's hopefully a positive side effect.
Yes, exactly right. And I mean, I suppose, I don't know whether it would be right to say his Campbell soup cans are the most famous painting or picture. It's almost like a screenshot, isn't it? It's not really a painting as such. It was sort of a printer inspired painting, really, in the same way that the Four Marilyns is the same kind of idea.
Well, and isn't there a story? I think didn't he pay his gallerist $50? He wrote out a check for $50, didn't he, for coming up with the idea, which is rather wonderful. Bearing in mind that's probably one of the most, outside the Mona Lisa and a few Impressionist paintings, that's probably one of the most iconic images. And also, I think what's great with Warhol, and this is the really interesting thing, is if you look at things like the Campbell soup or Elvis Presley's Gunslinger or whatever else, you see that is in almost every form of imagery that you see in advertising and design. It's everywhere. And what's really fun thing to do, going back to the sort of educational slant of what you're doing, the afternoon pieces, look up a few of Warhol's pieces on the internet, and then for the next week, open your eyes to advertising and to design. And when you walk around London or wherever you are, you'll see the echoes of that in everything. And every graphic designer is influenced, consciously or subconsciously. Yes. And that's the real effect of Warhol. He changed the way everything is designed and looks, and in a brilliant way.
Of course, and I suppose, knowing him as we do and as we did, he wouldn't have objected to that, people ripping him off, because he believed that nobody really owned anything.
And he's right. I think when you see people, these ridiculous sort of court cases about a piece of music and 5 bars or another thing, it's ridiculous. I mean, what is it? There are only 6 chords, whatever there is, and everything is ripped off from everything. Everyone is inspired by everything. And I think Warhol's completely correct. I think art should always be influenced. As long as it's influenced, it's not straightforward ripping someone off. It's fabulous, and I really enjoy that. And I think everyone should. I think, so much of pop music goes so much to classical music, and when you listen to modern music now, much of it will have been inspired by music that comes from the 70s or the 80s or whatever it is, or and when you listen to when rap reuses all the chords from other songs, I think that's fantastic. I love the cross pollination. I think the world is a richer place for it.
Yes, absolutely right. And as if to sort of to draw him in even further to kind of the American culture, somebody tried to kill him in 1968. Some crazed woman shot him twice, and people said actually that he never quite recovered from that. And when he eventually did die, I seem to remember he went into hospital for some kind of operation which got a bit botched, and he had some kind of intestinal problem, which kind of reverted back to when he was shot, right?
Yes, no, he had, I think in the end his heart gave way. I mean, it was a classic shock reaction, and it's sad. It's sad in America that business of so many people seem to there are so many. I mean, obviously, just too many bloody guns in America, aren't they? Because when you always think. I always look back and think about John Lennon when he was shot. He was still producing great music, and you always go, my gosh, it's not just. I mean, the sadness that he was married and had children. That's awful, but the world lost perhaps another 5 great albums. Imagine if we'd had another Imagine or another whatever. He was still writing fabulous music, and it's so sad when we lose a genius. I hate that. Mind you, I also think sometimes when you see greying old pop stars, you wonder whether they should have gone gracefully.
Well, there is an argument certainly for that. We shall leave those people alone who we are both talking about. Let me ask you a final question, Alex. How is the business? Because obviously you're in what would normally be a very kind of busy part of London, but which isn't particularly busy at the moment.
No, and I'm angry. I'm really furious with companies like Google and Facebook are trying to be all trendy and going, oh, you don't need to come back to work for 2 years. And you're like, what, just so you look good with your employees, but in fact you just put 5 pubs, a sandwich shop, and the local boozer out of business because there's 10,000 employees in King's Cross who aren't coming back for 2 years.
Right.
And it's frustrating because I think, central London, if you come to central London, there's sanitisers everywhere, everyone's cleaning. And the other big key thing is if you're not vulnerable, the key figure right now is 3 people died yesterday. I don't care if 3,000 people are infected. The point is protect the ill, protect people with diabetes, but beyond that, the rest of us should just get on with life.
But also, exactly. But also, I've made this point for about a month now, saying, for God's sake, what you don't want is a world full of people who literally don't go anywhere. And all they do is they sit around at home telling everyone how great it is.
I'm meeting the government minister this afternoon on behalf of the nighttime industry to just say, for heaven's sake, young people want to go out and have fun. They don't die of this disease. For young people, for the majority of young people, it's no worse than flu. But if you don't reopen nightclubs, they're going to go out to illegal raves where the only people who make money are drug dealers, and there aren't security guards. And we don't, for example, in my venues, we use the same fogging systems they use in the tube, and it stops any infections for a month. We use that weekly. We change the air every 10 minutes. We upgraded our ventilation. It's pretty damn safe, and I want the world to reopen just because I can't bear walking around central London. Well, I like being able to walk into my favourite restaurant in Covent Garden and sit outside without having to book. That's fun. But beyond that, it's a bloody disaster. And
I know.
And when November the 1st comes and suddenly you and I are old enough to remember Thatcher and 3 million unemployed and what that looked like with the Toxteth riots. And when we go to 5 million unemployment and it's cold in November and furlough ends and suddenly it's not so fun sitting around in your garden getting paid to do nothing, I'm really worried that suddenly the phony will end and suddenly this will all feel very real and we'll start going, what on earth are we doing? No one's really dying anymore. Let's get on with life and get back to normal. But, I mean, my restaurants, thank gosh, we're doing this Denise Van Outen show, the Cabaret All-Stars, and she's fabulous. And
she is.
And people travel in to see it. And we're actually, we're doing really well. The restaurant's doing well. I mean, my clubs can't open, but the restaurant side is good, and people love coming out. And I tell you what, after all these months, seeing people happy and smiling and laughing as she sings and makes jokes, it's life affirming, isn't it? It's actually life affirming because you think to yourself. So many people come up and say that they just go, "Thank you, I needed." People. One couple came. It was wonderful. A chap in a wheelchair and his girlfriend, and they had a dreadful lockdown. And the guy came up and said, tonight actually reignited our marriage, and we wanted to thank you. This has made lockdown okay. And you have wonderful moments like that. So, let's all get out there and start enjoying the greatest city in the world. It's still there, but if we don't look after it, it won't be there for much longer.
No, I totally agree. Alex, well, listen, I can finish you off with a great little quote here from a tweet from Cosmo, who said, Alex Proud was our favourite expert on 4 Rooms on Channel 4, knows his stuff and helps a lot of struggling artists. Top bloke. There you go. You got a fan. Good stuff. Listen, I'll come and buy you a beer one of these days. Thanks very much indeed. Alex Proud there from Proud Galleries, of course. A man that speaks an awful lot of sense, like all proper Londoners. He wants London back. We want London back. I know some of you listening to this will go, here he goes, going on about London again. It's not just London. If you live in Manchester, you want Manchester back. You want Leeds back. You want Glasgow back. You want Edinburgh back. We need it all back. Don't we? This is Talk Radio. Public of Mike Graham right here on Talk Radio. Here with you, of course, every day. The home of common sense from 10 till 1. Coming up after me, Ian Collins will be along very shortly to tell us what's going on in his world. And then Dan Wootton from 4. Kevin O'Sullivan from 7. Christo Fufas from 10. It's an absolute festival of common sense throughout the day and into the night as well. Let's go to the phones to talk to Lynn, who's in Southampton, I think, at a hospital. Hello, Lynn. Hello, Lynn. Are you there? Lynn's not there. Let's try Jonathan, who's in London. Hi, Jonathan.
Hi, Mike. How you doing?
Yeah, very well, sir. What can I do for you?
Well, it's great to be talking to the Home of Common Sense, first of all.
Thank you very much. Welcome.
Thank you. I just want to highlight the hypocrisy of the local councils in London relating to the road closures you were talking about and what are called LTNs, so low traffic neighbourhoods.
Oh, yeah.
So here in Ealing, we've had a number of sections of the areas shut off by planters, as you highlighted in the programme earlier. And there's a couple of major issues with it. First of all, they're duplicitous in terms of the reasons they put behind the implementation of the planters. 1 minute it's about coronavirus, next minute it's about safety, next minute it's about pollution. So they completely contradict themselves.
Right. And who gave them? And who sort of gave them permission to even do it?
Well, they didn't get any permission because they apply under emergency funding, which means they can just implement it, give you 1 week's notice, and then do it for 6 months, and then have the consultation at the end of the 6 months. So it's a real issue because all of the residents are up in arms because what they've done is not only anti-motorist, but it's also anti-resident, because what it does is it concentrates all the traffic onto the main roads, localises pollution massively in along congested routes, and it stops actually local residents, people moving about freely to go about their daily work. So,
well, what it also does is causes massive amounts of congestion in the surrounding roads and areas, because people wouldn't normally use those roads as rat runs, like ridiculously to a large extent, but they would use them a little bit. And the fact that they now can't means that there's even more pressure everywhere else.
And that's exactly right. And, we've had incidents here as well with emergency services. They're not able to get down the roads. They don't have the keys. Fire engines can't get through. We had an incident here that was also on the front of the metro in Ealing where an ambulance had to stop and go about 50 yards down the road because they couldn't actually get round and transport all of their stuff with them. So you've got this real issue of life and death as well that's causing a major issue. And it's just this hypocrisy of how councils are taking advantage of the current situation to money grab and then implement these schemes. And I think that's my final point for you, Mike, is they do it in the way that is as cheap as possible. So all of these planters cost significantly less relative to the amount of funding that they get. So I think Ealing took around £300,000 of money. You can imagine the cost of a few planters. The roads in Bollard.
About 50 quid down IKEA or something, right?
Exactly. So, they're pocketing a huge difference, which is there to cover not only their budget shortfalls, and some may argue champagne at the next, Ealing Council social gathering, and ultimately it's causing chaos and it's causing people real issues at a time when obviously we've all been struggling significantly, coming out of the back end of coronavirus.
Yeah. No, it's an absolute nightmare. Listen, Jonathan, thanks for the information. Let me quickly try and get Lynn back. I think we've got Lynn. Hello, Lynn.
Oh, hi there, Mike.
Hi there. Sorry, we couldn't hear you before. What have you got for me?
That's all right. No, I was just ringing up because I just wanted to sort of give you something about me going to the hospital on Saturday. First time I've been out probably in 8 months apart from the local shop.
Really?
Yeah. I suffered from panic attacks and everything before all this, so life is a little bit more difficult now.
Right.
But yeah, I finally caught up with an appointment for something totally different. At the hospital, so they did a Saturday afternoon appointment for me at Southampton General Hospital. So first time on a bus with my mask was stressful enough, but that was okay. Coming through Southampton city centre on the bus, you could see. I was amazed. It was packed.
Really?
The main shopping centre, the precinct, people everywhere.
Right.
And the restaurant's full. There was a market there, and I think we've got a lot of young people in town, obviously going to the university. So,
oh yeah, are these all the people that are terrified of going back to work? By the way,
I don't know about that.
I mean, there seems to be no shortage of people going out shopping and eating and drinking, but there's nobody going back to work.
Yeah, see, I've been cocooned in my little place at home, not wanting to go out, and then suddenly I realised that actually people are going out.
Yeah. It's a big wide world out there. What about, was the hospital busy?
This is what my point was. So I get to the hospital and they've got security on the door. They ask you the one main question, no heat tests or anything like that, temperature tests.
Right.
How do you think you've had symptoms in the last 7 days? Well, no, okay. Got in there, and actually it was the biggest ghost town in the world.
Wow.
I mean, I could not believe, I'd heard that from somebody else, but I was absolutely, flabbergasted, really, from seeing Southampton city centre with all the shoppers to the hospital being completely empty.
Right.
It was quite
if you flew somebody in from Mars and said, this is what a pandemic looks like, they'd go, nah, don't think so. Listen, Lynn, thanks for calling and great information. It's always good to get information from what's going on out there.